There's a hill in West Java, Indonesia, that doesn't look like much from a distance. Terraced slopes, some scattered stones, a bit of jungle creeping in at the edges. Locals have known about it for centuries. They call it Gunung Padang, the Mountain of Enlightenment. But here's the question that's been tearing the archaeological world apart for over a decade. What if it's not a hill at all? What if underneath all that dirt and vegetation, there's something built, something ancient, something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about human history? Some researchers claim there's a massive structure buried inside this hill, layers of construction going back not thousands of years, but tens of thousands. We're talking about a date so old it would predate agriculture, predate writing, predate every civilization we've ever studied in a history class, predate Stonehenge by 20,000 years, predate the pyramids of Egypt by an almost unthinkable margin. If it's true, we'd have to rewrite the story of when humans started building on a massive scale. And if it's not true, well, that's a story too. A story about how a real archaeological site gets swept up into something much bigger than the evidence can support. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I read every comment and it's wild seeing this pop up. Jakarta at midnight, Toronto during a lunch break, London right before bed. People all over the planet trying to untangle the same mystery at completely different hours. Drop it below. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this one without any ads interrupting the flow, follow this show on Spotify. It's the easiest way to support what we do here, completely free, and it makes a real difference. If you're already there, a 5-star review helps more than you'd think. Links in the description. Okay, so here's how we're going to handle this. Because a story like Gunung Padang comes with 2 very different tracks running side by side, and if you mix them up, you end up either dismissing something genuinely interesting or believing something that isn't actually supported. So we're going to separate 3 things very carefully. What's been measured? What's been interpreted from those measurements? And what's still, honestly, a complete unknown? Because in archaeology, those are 3 very different categories, and a lot of the confusion around this site comes from people blending them into one simple headline. We're going to walk through core samples pulled from deep inside the hill. We're going to look at radiocarbon dates that sparked one of the most heated academic disputes in recent memory. We're going to dig into the geology of the region, because sometimes volcanic rock does things that look suspiciously man-made even when it isn't. And we're going to follow an ongoing academic fight. Researchers publishing papers, other researchers demanding retractions, a controversy that's still not fully settled, even as you're watching this. So is Gunung Padang the oldest pyramid on Earth? Or is it a fascinating, very real ancient site that got wrapped up in a claim way bigger than the evidence can carry? Let's start with the basics, where this place actually is, and why it caught the world's attention in the first place. Let's start with geography, because you need to picture this place before any of the controversy makes sense. Gunung Padang sits in the highlands of West Java, Indonesia, not far from the city of Cianjur, tucked into a landscape that's classic Indonesian volcanic terrain. Rolling hills, thick vegetation, rice paddies in the valleys below, and volcanoes on the horizon that remind you this entire region was built by fire. To get there, you drive out from the nearest towns on roads that get progressively narrower and bumpier. Then you park and climb. And I mean climb. There are hundreds of stone steps leading up the hillside, steep enough that by the time you reach the top, you're not thinking about ancient mysteries. You're thinking about your legs. But once you catch your breath, what you see at the summit is genuinely striking. The hill rises in a series of flat terraces, 5 of them stacked on top of each other, each one a little smaller than the one below it, like a stepped pyramid that's been softened by centuries of erosion and jungle growth. And scattered across these terraces, sometimes in neat rows, sometimes in clusters that look almost deliberate, are thousands of elongated stone columns. These aren't quarried blocks in the way you'd picture at, say, an Egyptian temple. They're naturally hexagonal or pentagonal basalt columns, long and dark, the kind of rock that forms when lava cools slowly and cracks into geometric shapes. Locals and researchers alike have arranged and stacked these columns for generations, creating walls, staircases, platforms, even what look like small altars or gathering spaces on the upper terraces. Walk across the site and you'll notice patterns. Rows of columns lined up like fence posts, rectangular platforms bordered by stone, steps built directly into natural rock formations. It has the unmistakable feel of a place that mattered to people, a place shaped by human hands over a long period of time. Nobody seriously disputes that. Even the most skeptical archaeologists agree that Gunung Padang is a genuine megalithic site, meaning it was built using large stones arranged by human effort, without mortar, in a style associated with prehistoric monument building found all over the world, from the standing stones of Europe to burial structures in Korea, to sites scattered across the Pacific. So, on the surface, at ground level, this is straightforward. It's an old, impressive, human-made terraced structure sitting on top of a hill. That part isn't the controversy. The controversy is what's underneath. Because starting in the early 2010s, a team of Indonesian researchers began publishing findings suggesting there was something inside the hill, not just stone terraces resting on natural bedrock, but layered construction going many meters deep. Chambers, maybe. Man-made fill material, maybe. Structures that, if real, would have been built long before anything else we've documented in human history, long before the earliest known agricultural societies, long before writing, long before what most textbooks describe as the dawn of civilization. And when word of this got out, it didn't stay in academic circles for long. It became headlines, it became documentaries, it became the kind of story that spreads across social media with titles like The Oldest Pyramid on Earth, or Scientists Baffled by 25,000-year-old Structure. Because if true, this wouldn't just be an interesting archaeological footnote. It would mean rewriting the timeline of when humans started organizing labor, moving massive amounts of material, and constructing monumental architecture. It would push that timeline back by tens of thousands of years, further than Stonehenge, further than the pyramids of Egypt, further than almost anything we currently associate with the birth of complex human societies. Naturally, this claim didn't sit quietly. It triggered one of the more heated disputes in recent archaeology, and that's really what put Gunung Padang on the global map. Not just the site itself, fascinating as it is, but the fight over what it means. On one side you have researchers who argue the deep layers detected inside the hill represent genuine ancient construction, built in stages over an almost unimaginable span of time. On the other side you have archaeologists and geologists who look at the same data and see something very different. A natural volcanic hill shaped by lava flows and erosion, that humans later modified on the surface, adding the terraces and stone arrangements we can clearly see today, but without any hidden pyramid buried inside. Both sides are looking at the same hill. They just disagree, sometimes very loudly, about what the evidence actually shows. Now, before we go any deeper into who found what and when, it helps to nail down a few terms we'll be using a lot because this story gets technical fast, and getting these definitions straight now will save a lot of confusion later. First, megalithic. This just means built from large stones, typically without mortar or cement holding them together. Stonehenge is megalithic. The Moai statues on Easter Island sit within a megalithic tradition, and the terraces at Gunung Padang, with their stacked basalt columns, absolutely qualify. This term describes what's visible on the surface, and it's not really in dispute. Second, terrace. In this context, a terrace is a flattened, level section built into a slope, usually supported by retaining walls, creating usable flat space on what would otherwise be a steep hillside. Gunung Padang has 5 of these stacked terraces, and building them, especially by hand, using nothing but stone and labour, would have taken serious planning and serious effort, regardless of when it happened. Third, core sample. This is one you'll hear constantly as we get into the deeper controversy. A core sample is a long cylindrical piece of material extracted by drilling straight down into the ground, kind of like using an apple corer, except instead of fruit, you're pulling up soil, rock and sediment layers in the exact order they were deposited. Core samples let researchers see what's beneath the surface without excavating the entire site, and they're central to the claims about what might be hiding inside this hill. And fourth, radiocarbon dating. This is the method used to estimate how old organic material is, based on the predictable decay rate of a radioactive form of carbon found in all living things. It works well on things like charcoal, bone or plant material, but here's the catch, and it's a big one we'll come back to repeatedly. Radiocarbon dating tells you how old the organic material itself is. It does not automatically tell you how old the surrounding structure is, unless you're very careful about the context in which that material was found. And as we'll see, context is exactly where this entire debate starts to get messy. So that's the setup. A real hill in a real volcanic region of West Java, with real megalithic terraces that people have been visiting, studying, and honouring for generations. A surface site that nobody seriously questions, and a claim about what lies beneath it that has split the archaeological community into 2 very different camps. One camp says the evidence points to something extraordinary, a construction project that predates everything we thought we knew. The other camp says the evidence is being misread, and what looks extraordinary is actually a natural landform with a human-made surface layered on top of it. We're not going to pick a side just yet. We're going to build this up piece by piece, the same way the researchers did, starting with how this site was actually discovered, and how a quiet hill in the Indonesian countryside became one of the most disputed places in modern archaeology. If you ask the people who live around Gunung Padang when it was discovered, they'll probably look at you like the question doesn't make sense. From their perspective, it was never lost. The hill has long been tied into local tradition. It's been a sacred place, a spot associated with meditation, offerings and legends that stretch back into the hazy category locals simply call the time of the ancestors. Stories talk about powerful kings, legendary figures like Siliwangi, and supernatural builders who moved stones with more than just muscle. None of this is archaeological data in the strict sense, but it matters because it tells you something crucial. By the time any modern scientist showed up with notebooks and measuring tapes, Gunung Padang was already embedded in human memory. People knew there were strange stones on the hill. They climbed it, they prayed there, they told their kids, this is an old place. Formal documentation, though, is a lot more recent. In the early 20th century, during the Dutch colonial period, surveyors and administrators crisscrossed Java mapping plantations, villages and infrastructure. Somewhere in those decades, Gunung Padang flickers into the written record, a note in a report, a mention of ancient stones on a hill. Not a full excavation, not a grand unveiling, just a recognition that, yes, there is a megalithic site here worth writing down. Then for a while it mostly sat there. After independence, Indonesia had more immediate concerns than one obscure hill in West Java. Archaeologists knew about the big showpiece sites, Borobudur, Prambanan, the great Hindu-Buddhist temples that dominate central Java. Against those, Gunung Padang looked small, rural, almost modest. A handful of specialists visited, took measurements, sketched the terraces, confirmed that it was indeed a megalithic complex and likely quite old in regional terms. But it wasn't yet cast as a world-changing mystery. It was one more entry in the long list of Indonesian prehistoric sites. What changed was the shift from "there are stones on a hill" to "how old are they, and what exactly are they sitting on?" That shift began in earnest in the late 20th century, when Indonesian archaeologists started revisiting older sites with newer methods and fresh questions. Radiocarbon dating had become standard. Geophysics was moving from oil exploration into archaeology. Suddenly, a place like Gunung Padang wasn't just a curiosity. It was a test case. What happens when you aim modern tools at a traditional sacred hill? Initial modern surveys at Gunung Padang, especially in the 1970s and 80s, stayed close to the surface. Researchers mapped the terraces in detail, catalogued the stone arrangements, and compared the style to other megalithic sites in the region. The consensus emerging from those early studies was fairly straightforward. This is a prehistoric monument, probably several thousand years old, constructed by stacking and arranging naturally formed basalt columns into terraces and platforms. Impressive, yes. Unique in some of its details, yes. But still broadly fitting within the known timeline of Southeast Asian megalithic culture. At this stage, nobody was seriously arguing for a 20,000-year-old anything. The hill was assumed to be, well, a hill, volcanic in origin, later modified by humans who carved terraces into its slopes and recycled loose basalt columns into walls and steps. Surface archaeology saw surfaces, and the story stopped more or less there. The real plot twist arrives in the early 2000s, and especially the 2010s, when a new wave of researchers, often with interdisciplinary backgrounds in geology, engineering and geophysics, started looking at Gunung Padang not just as a monument on a hill, but as a possible monument that is the hill. Instead of limiting themselves to what you can trowel or brush, they brought in different tools. Ground-penetrating radar to send electromagnetic pulses into the subsurface, electrical resistivity surveys to measure how well the ground conducts electricity, seismic methods to track how vibrations move through the interior, and most dramatically, core drilling, driving cylindrical drills deep into the hill to pull up continuous samples of whatever lay beneath. This is the moment when Gunung Padang steps out of regional obscurity and into global controversy. Because those subsurface investigations did not produce the boring geology textbook picture many expected. Instead, some teams reported what they interpreted as distinct layers of construction, zones of broken rock that looked, to their eyes, like deliberately placed fill, and anomalies that could be voids or chambers. They obtained radiocarbon dates from organic materials within those cores, charcoal fragments, bits of soil, some of which came back with surprisingly ancient ages. Now the narrative fractures. One camp looked at those results and said, "We're not dealing with a simple hill anymore. We're seeing stages of construction reaching tens of meters down, potentially spanning tens of thousands of years." Another camp, many of them trained as geologists and conventional archaeologists, looked at the same kinds of data and said, "Slow down. Volcanic hills are messy. Weathering, landslides, and natural jointing can produce layered, chaotic interiors that look artificial if you want them to. Radiocarbon dates from cores without clear archaeological context tell you when something organic ended up in that crack, not when someone supposedly built a pyramid around it." While that scientific argument was still very much in progress, the media found the story. And once that happened, the timeline of research got entangled with the timeline of public attention. Headlines began to appear. The world's oldest pyramid, ancient civilization hidden under Indonesian hill. Some documentaries framed Gunung Padang as the smoking gun for lost prehistoric civilizations. Social media amplified the most dramatic interpretation, a 25,000-year-old man-made pyramid buried under jungle. Nuance didn't just get lost, it got bulldozed. The effect of this attention was double-edged. On the one hand, it brought funding, political support, and more fieldwork. The Indonesian government backed further investigations. More cores were drilled. More geophysical grids were laid out. More samples were dated. On the other hand, it polarized the debate. If you expressed skepticism, you risked being cast as a closed-minded gatekeeper, blocking a paradigm shift. If you embraced the deep time pyramid narrative too quickly, you risked stepping outside the norms of cautious interpretation that archaeology depends on. By the mid-2010s, Gunung Padang had become less a site and more a question mark. The question wasn't just, how old is this place? It was deeper. Where do we draw the line between cultural construction and natural geology? Which terraces, layers and features are absolutely human-made? Which are human-modified natural formations, and which are simply the products of volcanic processes that our pattern-hungry brains are desperate to turn into architecture? Everything that follows in this story, every core sample, every date, every argument, spins around that central problem. Is Gunung Padang a hill with a monument on top, or a monument disguised as a hill? To get any closer to an answer, we need to strip things back to what's least controversial. The part we can walk on, measure and agree is unmistakably the work of human hands. That means zooming in on the surface monument itself, the terraces and stones that started this whole investigation. Walk up the path to Gunung Padang and ignore, for a moment, everything you've heard about pyramids and lost civilizations. What you actually encounter first is simple and concrete: steps, terraces and stones. Whatever else is going on inside the hill, the skin of the place is not a mystery. It's architecture. Gunung Padang's monument is laid out in a series of stepped terraces climbing the upper slope, like a giant staircase that someone flattened into platforms. Most descriptions break it into 5 main terrace levels, stacked one above the other. Each terrace is bounded and defined by low walls or revetments built from long prismatic blocks of dark volcanic rock. You walk through narrow openings, climb more steps, and emerge onto the next level, each platform slightly smaller and higher than the last, until you reach the uppermost area where the densest clusters of stones lie. The construction elements repeat with almost hypnotic regularity. Bordering the edges of the terraces are rows of upright or slightly tilted columns, placed side by side like the teeth of a comb. Behind and between them are horizontal stones laid flat, forming pavements, steps and rough platforms. Some clusters look like seats or benches, short lines of columns arranged in rectangles or circles, their tops roughly level, as if someone once sat or placed offerings there. Others form low cairns or stone gardens, collections of columns stacked and leaned together in organized chaos. The stones themselves are the key. They're not carved blocks in the way you might picture Egyptian pyramids. They're naturally formed basalt columns, volcanic rock, that cooled and fractured into elongated hexagonal or polygonal prisms. In the landscape around West Java, these columnar basalts occur in outcrops and boulder fields. At Gunung Padang, people took those ready-made columns and treated them like a giant box of Lego. On the surface, you can see how they're arranged with intent. In retaining walls, the columns are often set with their long axis aligned along the slope, overlapping like a dry stone version of log construction. In steps, they may be laid crosswise, their ends forming the tread. In pavements, they're packed side by side, sometimes with smaller stones chocking the gaps. There's no mortar in the classic sense. This is gravity engineering, relying on weight, friction, and the interlocking geometry of the columns. In some spots, the arrangement is almost geometric. Parallel alignments, orthogonal corners, repeating patterns of orientation. In others, it's more opportunistic, using whatever stones fit. That mix is important. It tells you you're not looking at a single uniform construction event. You're looking at something built, rebuilt, added to, repaired. A living monument, not a one-off project. If you zoom out from this one hill and look at Indonesia's prehistoric landscape, Gunung Padang doesn't sit alone. Megalithic terrace sites are scattered across the archipelago, especially in highland regions. Stone platforms, step-like terraces, aligned menhirs, burial mounds, and ceremonial plazas. In many of these places, people used whatever stone was locally abundant. In the basalt-rich zones of West Java, that means columnar basalt. Archaeologists who specialize in Southeast Asian prehistory tend to interpret these terraces as ritual and ceremonial spaces, not agricultural fields or simple retaining walls. The layouts suggest gathering areas, processional routes, places where people stood, watched and participated in events. At Gunung Padang, the orientation of the main terrace axis, the concentration of stones on the upper levels, and the long-standing tradition of the site as a place of prayer all fit that pattern. It looks, in broad terms, like an enlarged, elaborated version of other megalithic sanctuaries in the region. When it comes to age, the surface features are actually the least controversial part of the whole story. Excavations and test pits in the upper terraces have produced cultural layers, soils mixed with charcoal, pottery fragments, and other traces of human activity, above and between the stones. Radiocarbon dates from these contexts, where they're clearly tied to human use of the terrace surfaces, generally fall into the mid to late Holocene. We're talking a few thousand years old, on the order of, very roughly, 2,000 to 4,000 years before present, depending on which layer and which sample you look at. Those numbers fit comfortably within what we already know about Indonesian megalithic traditions. Across the archipelago, terrace sites, stone platforms, and megalithic ritual centres cluster in that broad time frame. Late Neolithic into the early Metal Ages, continuing in some regions right into historical periods. In that sense, Gunung Padang's upper architecture is not an outlier. It's old, but it's not an Ice Age anomaly based on the surface evidence alone. This is where it becomes crucial to separate what's original from what's later repair and restoration. Gunung Padang has been a sacred and visited place for a very long time. People don't just build a monument and walk away, they maintain it. They re-level stones after earthquakes. They rebuild collapsed walls. They move columns to create new seating arrangements or ritual focal points as practices change. Some of this maintenance is ancient. Archaeologists can see stratigraphic hints of it, earlier pavements buried under later stone dumps, rearranged clusters that cut into older layers. Some of it is modern or recent historical, colonial era and Indonesian restorations tidying loose stones, stabilizing steps, re-erecting fallen columns to make the site more legible and safer for visitors. When you stand on a terrace edge today, you're often looking at a palimpsest, a face that has been redrawn multiple times. In the most cautious mainstream reading, the sequence goes something like this. A natural volcanic hill exists. At some point in the Holocene, communities begin cutting into its upper slopes and arranging basalt columns into terraces and platforms. Over centuries, maybe millennia, those terraces are used, modified, expanded, partially collapse, and are repaired. Later visitors, including modern conservation teams, continue that cycle of rearrangement and stabilization. The surface monument you see now is the latest visible state of a long-running architectural conversation between people and a hill. None of that requires a buried pyramid. None of it rules one out either. It just grounds us in what we can actually touch and date, a stepped basalt-built sanctuary whose surface activity lines up with the known megalithic tradition of the region. To claim anything deeper in time, you have to leave the open air and enter the interior of the hill into the realm of cause, geophysics, and contested interpretations. Before we dive underground, though, we need to understand the stage on which this whole debate is built, the geology that supplied those stones in the first place. To understand why Gunung Padang looks the way it does, and why it's so easy to see patterns there, we have to talk about one of geology's best party tricks, columnar basalt. Basalt is what you get when runny, iron-rich lava cools. If that cooling happens slowly and evenly enough, the rock shrinks and cracks in a very particular way. Instead of just breaking randomly, it forms a network of fractures that try to relieve the stress as efficiently as possible. The result is a field of long, mostly hexagonal prisms that stand upright, or lie in tangled heaps, columnar jointing. If you've seen the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, Devil's Postpile in California, or the colonnades of Iceland's lava fields, you already know what this looks like. Perfectly straight, multi-sided pillars packed together like a bundle of pencils. You don't have to carve these. Nature does the carving for you. This is the first key to Gunung Padang. The blocks people are working with are not quarried, squared stones. They're broken pieces of a pre-existing geometric pattern. When those columns fracture and tumble down slopes, they naturally arrange themselves into piles, fans, and rough alignments that already look halfway like masonry. Gravity pulls the long axes downhill. Columns roll and come to rest parallel to the steepest direction. If you get a small landslide of columns, they can stack like logs, creating something that, from the right angle, could pass for a wall or a step, even if no human hand ever touched it. Water flow can sort and orient them further, washing away fines and leaving the big prisms in neat-looking clusters. This is why columnar basalts are both a dream and a nightmare at archaeological sites. They're a dream because they give builders a free supply of ready-made beams. They're a nightmare because they can mimic the visual cues our brains use to detect architecture. Straight lines, repeating angles, rectilinear edges. You're standing on a volcano's self-organized geometry, and your pattern recognition hardware is firing on all cylinders. Zoom out from the stones to the whole landform. Gunung Padang is not an isolated cone like a textbook volcano. It's part of a broader volcanic landscape, a region pockmarked with old vents, lava flows, and intrusive bodies that have been uplifted, eroded, and reworked by millions of years of tropical weather. Volcanic hills can form in several ways. You can have a plug, solidified magma in a vent that resists erosion while the softer surroundings wear away, leaving a knob or ridge. You can have stacked lava flows, each laying down a new sheet of basalt or andesite over the previous one, building a layered cake of rock. You can have volcanic lastics, ash, tuff, breccias, blanketing older formations, then being partly stripped back by rivers and landslides. All of these processes create layers, slopes, and breaks in slope that, viewed later, can look eerily like stepped construction. A resistant flow unit may form a bench. A weaker, more erodible layer beneath it gets carved out, steepening the face. Repeat that several times, and you get a natural terracing effect. If columnar basalt is involved, those benches might even be edged with lines of broken prisms that resemble retaining walls. So how do geologists decide whether they're looking at rock doing its own thing, or rock rearranged with intent? They don't rely on a single aha detail. They look for converging lines of evidence. One thing they examine is context. Are the columns in place, still rooted in a coherent flow with joints radiating out in predictable patterns? If so, you're probably looking at in situ geology. Or are the columns clearly detached, jumbled, and sitting in deposits that cut across older layers, suggestive of human relocation or mass wasting. Orientation is another clue. Natural column falls tend to show preferred orientations tied to slope and gravity. Human-built walls often break that rule. If you see columns consistently laid cross-slope, ends out, forming regular faces, that tips the scale toward construction. Patterns of trimming, pecking, or dressing, however minimal, also matter. Even slight modification of ends and contact surfaces can distinguish picked up from a talus pile from still lying exactly where it fell 100,000 years ago. Packing and interface details are critical. Natural piles usually show more voids, irregular contacts, and unsystematic size variation. Built features tend to minimize gaps, wedge smaller stones into key spots, and repeat certain jointing strategies like alternating long and short ends in a wall face that don't arise easily from random fall. But the ground doesn't just sit there politely preserving either natural or human patterns. Hills are constantly moving, even when they look still. On a slope like Gunung Padang, soil and loose rock slowly creep downhill under their own weight. Tree roots pry stones apart, then topple and drag them down slope when the trees fall. Heavy tropical rains trigger shallow slips and deeper landslides that can dislodge blocks, rotate them, and bury once visible surfaces under new colluvium. Over centuries, that means artifacts and architectural elements can migrate. A stone that started in a wall upslope can end up half-buried meters away. A terrace edge can slump, its front row of columns collapsing, and then being partly covered by soil creep, only to be re-exposed later by erosion or human cleaning. Meanwhile, younger cultural layers, hearths, trash deposits, offerings, can be dragged downslope or covered by slope wash, creating confusing juxtapositions in the stratigraphy. This is how tools, charcoal, and even structural stones can end up buried at surprising depths without requiring a deep, hidden building beneath. The hill is not a static bookshelf with neatly stacked archaeological volumes. It's more like a slow conveyor belt, constantly rearranging the pieces unless someone intervenes to shore them up. And that brings us to an idea that sits right at the heart of the Gunung Padang argument. What exactly do we mean by a pyramid here? One extreme in the discussion imagines an engineered hill, a largely artificial, deliberately shaped core, internal walls, chambers, maybe even solid fill, clad in terraces, like the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica or the buried ziggurats of Mesopotamia. In that scenario, the natural rock is merely raw material. The overall mass and geometry are human-designed. The more conservative interpretation is a modified natural hill. In that picture, the bulk of the landform is volcanic, flows, breccias, weathered bedrock, already present as a convenient high point. Humans later carve into its flanks, add terraces, cut platforms and rearrange surface and near-surface stones to create a sacred architecture that hugs and slightly reshapes the existing slopes. Distinguishing between those two possibilities is not a matter of staring at the outline from a distance and deciding whether it looks pyramid-like. It requires interrogating the interior, tracking where natural layering stops and human fill begins, separating ancient slope deposits from deliberate backfill, and asking whether any deep, coherent structural system exists below the visible monument. To do that, you have to move beyond what your eyes can see on the surface. You need drills, cores, and instruments that can peer into the hill without tearing it apart, tools that promise to turn a volcanic puzzle into something like an X-ray. That's where the debate at Gunung Padang really starts to heat up. When supporters of the buried pyramid idea talk about Gunung Padang, they're not just thinking about the terraces you can walk on today. They're imagining a multi-layered structure that extends far below the visible steps, like an iceberg of architecture with only its tip exposed. In their model, the stone terraces at the top are just phase one of the story. That's the part everyone agrees is human-made in some sense, arranged basalt columns forming flat platforms and steps near the summit. But for the pyramid proponents, those visible terraces are the youngest, most recent layer of a much older and more complex construction sequence. They propose something like this. At the bottom is a natural volcanic core, a hill or plug formed long before any humans showed up. On top of that, in their telling, an extremely ancient culture begins to work. They don't just decorate the surface, they carve into it, reshape it, and then encase it in artificial layers. They import and arrange basalt columns, pour or tamp in fill material, and build internal walls or buttresses. Over deep time, more fill, more terraces, and more renovations get added higher up the slope. The result, if you follow their logic, is a vertically stacked system of zones. The upper zone is what we see, stone terraces, retaining lines of basalt columns and platform surfaces. Beneath that, they claim, lies an intermediate zone of structured fill and buried terraces. Here, the material would be a mix of soil, smaller stones, and basalt columns that are supposedly not just random landslide debris, but deliberately placed bedding and backfill, tying together internal retaining walls. Below that, they argue for an even deeper engineered layer, a massive, symmetric arrangement of stone and compacted material forming what they describe as a pyramidal or stepped core. In some reconstructions, this core is imagined as having regular slopes, oriented along specific cardinal or azimuthal directions with internal voids and chambers. That's where the hidden rooms come in. Proponents point to geophysical anomalies, zones that appear less dense, more conductive, or otherwise different from the surrounding rock, and interpret them as possible hollow spaces. In their scenario, these are not just random cavities in volcanic rock. They are purpose-built chambers, rooms or galleries within the hill, maybe connected by passages, maybe sealed off intentionally. The story sometimes goes further. In some popular accounts, those hypothetical chambers aren't just empty air pockets. They're imagined as ritual spaces, burial vaults, or time capsules from a forgotten civilization. You'll see claims of rooms that might contain artifacts, statues, sophisticated tools, or evidence of lost technology. None of that has been demonstrated, but within the pyramid narrative, the anomalies are treated as blueprints, outlines of walls, ceilings, and interior architecture. To knit this all together, supporters propose a multi-phase construction history. In one version, the deepest layers, the ones they argue are the most regular in the geophysical images, are said to be the oldest. These would be the foundational pyramid, the first massive shaping of the hill into a stepped or tapered monument, perhaps dating back tens of thousands of years. Later, according to this view, new groups come along and refurbish or expand the monument. They add terraces higher up, re-level platforms, refresh retaining walls, and perform new rituals. The Gunung Padang you can climb today is, in this narrative, the latest chapter of a very long architectural biography written on top of an original pyramid that has been successively buried, masked, and reworked. So why call it a pyramid at all, instead of a stepped sanctuary or a terraced hill? For proponents, two ideas drive that choice of word. First, they argue that if you strip away the soil and vegetation, the underlying mass would show a coherent geometric form, a roughly symmetrical, four- or multi-sided structure with consistent slopes, like a heavily eroded step pyramid. Second, they claim that internal features, hypothetical walls, chambers, and fill layers, line up with that outer geometry in ways that suggest intentional design rather than coincidental geology. The pyramid label is strategic too. It plugs Gunung Padang into a familiar mental category. Pyramids mean engineering, planning, and civilization on a large scale. If Gunung Padang is a pyramid, then it's easy to argue that we're not just looking at local stone-moving farmers, but at something grand, organised, and possibly very old. That brings us to the headline everyone keeps repeating, 25,000 years. Where does that number come from? Conceptually, it doesn't come from a single block with a date stamped on it. It doesn't come from a skeleton found in a sealed chamber with a nice, clean radiocarbon result. The 25,000 years figure, in the way proponents use it, is more like a package deal, a synthesis of several claims that all lean in the same direction. The logic goes something like this. If the deepest anomalies really are human-made structures, and if some of the material associated with those depths really is as old as the more extreme radiocarbon dates that have been mentioned, and if those samples truly come from construction-related contexts rather than natural sediments or later intrusions, then the earliest phase of building at Gunung Padang might reach back into the late Pleistocene, on the order of 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, or even more in some, telling that if and if and if bundle is important. The age claim is not just the charcoal is old, it's the charcoal is old and it belongs to the earliest construction phase of a huge engineered monument hidden inside this hill. Those are separate propositions that all have to be true simultaneously for the 25,000-year-old pyramid narrative to stand. So, framed carefully, the pyramid idea at Gunung Padang is a layered hypothesis, not a demonstrated fact. It says, below the visible terraces there exists a coherent, human-made geometric structure with internal chambers and engineered fill. The construction unfolded in multiple phases, some of which are far older than any known monumental architecture, and the deepest of those phases may date back around 25,000 years or more. To move that from intriguing speculation to accepted history would require a specific kind of proof. Clear excavation of those deeper zones, direct observation of walls, rooms or engineered voids, well-documented stratigraphy showing where natural rock ends and artificial construction begins. Securely dated materials that can be unambiguously tied to building events, not to later fires, burials or natural processes. In other words, if there is a buried pyramid under Gunung Padang, it has to reveal itself not just as a shape in a scan, but as a structure in the ground. And the first step in testing that is to understand what those instruments are really seeing when they look inside a volcanic hill. That's where the drills, the cores and the geophysical surveys come back into the story, along with the very real limits of what they can actually tell us. If you want to turn a maybe there's something in their story into we have some idea what that something might be, you don't start by blasting open the hill. You start with the least destructive tools you can. At Gunung Padang, one of the main tools has been core drilling. Think of core drilling as taking a biopsy of the earth. You pick a spot on the surface. You drive a hollow tube with a cutting bit straight down into the ground. As it spins, it cuts a narrow cylinder of whatever it passes through. Soil, gravel, broken rock, solid bedrock. When you pull it back up, you've got a vertical slice of the hill, maybe a few centimetres wide, several metres long, frozen in the order it was drilled. That cylinder is the core. On the table, it doesn't look like a pyramid or a chamber or a wall. It looks like a stack of materials changing with depth. Darker soil here, lighter ash there, then chunks of basalt, then maybe a solid block of volcanic rock. You read it from top to bottom like a timeline. The surface is the most recent. The deeper you go, the further back in time you're supposed to be looking. Supposed to be. The power and the problem of cores is that they give you extraordinary detail in an extraordinarily tiny column. You're peering into a massive three-dimensional hill through the equivalent of a drinking straw. Interpreting that straw-sized view is all about stratigraphy, the study of layers. In a simple, undisturbed natural setting, those layers follow rules. Fine volcanic ash settles out after an eruption and forms a thin, uniform band. Over time, vegetation breaks down into darker soils on top. Landslides dump jumbled rock here and there. Water sorts grains by size. Geologists learn to recognize these patterns, horizontal or gently dipping beds, gradual transitions between one sediment type and another, signs of weathering at old surfaces. Construction fill looks different. When humans build, they break the rules of slow, patient geology. They dig a cut into the natural ground. They pour in mixed material, broken stone and soil, and bits of charcoal and whatever else is lying around. They tamp it down. They build retaining walls. They backfill behind them with rubble to hold everything in place. In a core, engineered fill can show up as sharp boundaries, clean breaks between one material and the next instead of gradual blending, jumbled fragments where you wouldn't expect them naturally, angular stones all at odd angles instead of lying flat, repeated sequences that look the same in different cores at the same depth, suggesting a deliberately made level rather than random accumulation. At least that's the theory. Supporters of the pyramid model at Gunung Padang argue that some of the cores show exactly this kind of pattern. They point to zones of compacted material, mixed small stones, and chunks of basalt column not obviously attached to bedrock. They interpret certain breaks in the core as transitions between natural hill and artificial construction. To them, these aren't just landslide deposits. They're deliberate backfill holding up buried terraces and perhaps the flanks of a man-made structure. Critics look at the same cores and see something else. Gunung Padang sits in a volcanic landscape. Volcanic cones, lava flows, explosive eruptions, slope failures, deep weathering, all of that can create complicated, messy stratigraphy. A basalt column fallen from a natural outcrop and buried by soil can look awfully similar in a narrow core to a basalt column placed by human hands and then covered. A chaotic rockfall that has been slowly compacted over thousands of years can mimic engineered fill if you only see a few centimetres across. Here's where the limitations of coring really bite. First, it's tiny. A hill the size of Gunung Padang might be sampled with a few dozen cores at best. Each core represents a narrow cylinder through an enormous volume of rock and soil. You can miss walls, chambers or boundaries by a metre to one side and never know they were there. You can also hit an odd pocket of disturbed material and overinterpret it as evidence of a major structure. Second, drilling is not a gentle process. The bit can smear material from one layer into another. Water or drilling fluid can wash fine particles up and down the hole. Fragile boundaries get scuffed or obliterated. When the core finally comes out of the tube, it can be broken, rotated, or slightly out of order, and someone has to carefully reassemble it and guess which piece goes exactly where. Third, context is fragile. If you find a piece of charcoal at 20 meters down in a core, that depth doesn't automatically mean it belongs to a 20-meter deep construction phase. Roots can drag material downward. Cracks and burrows can act as pipes, letting younger carbon migrate into older layers. A single burrowing animal or tree root can drag modern material deep enough to confuse an unwary interpreter. And every time a core is cut, handled, split, labelled, transported or sampled in the lab, there's another chance for contamination. Dust from other samples, modern carbon from the air, even fingerprints can complicate later attempts to date microscopic bits of organic material. Cores are fantastic at telling you something changes here. They're much weaker at telling you exactly why. A sharp transition at 10 meters down might mean the base of a constructed terrace. It might also mean the surface of an old lava flow, or the boundary of an ancient landslide, or a natural weathering front where rock crumbled into soil. Without seeing the wider geometry of that boundary, does it run straight and level across the hillside, or does it follow the irregular shape of old volcanic rock, you're mostly guessing. That's why in mainstream geology and archaeology, cores are treated as clues, not verdicts. They suggest where to look more closely. They highlight layers that deserve more careful study. They help calibrate geophysical images by providing ground truth at specific points. But by themselves, they almost never confirm a pyramid, especially inside a complex volcanic hill. To move beyond educated speculation, you need to open up space around those intriguing depths. You need controlled excavation, not random digging, not treasure hunting, but carefully planned trenches and tunnels that expose broader areas of the suspected layers. Excavations that reveal how stones relate to each other in 3 dimensions. Are they part of a wall, a terrace face, a collapsed natural outcrop? Are the contacts between materials straight, stepped and regular, or curved and irregular? Do features line up from one trench to another, forming coherent structures instead of isolated oddities? Only when you can see those relationships in open view can you really tell whether the patterns hinted at in a core represent human architecture or the chaotic artistry of geology. And only then do radiocarbon samples, taken from undisturbed contexts with clearly visible boundaries, begin to anchor a reliable timeline. So the cores at Gunung Padang matter. They're part of the evidence, and some of what they show is genuinely intriguing. But they're not the final word. They're more like signposts. Interesting things might be happening at this depth. The next questions become, how do we map what's between the signposts, and how do we link those depths, those layers, to actual dates in time? That's where the other tools, geophysical scans and radiocarbon dating, enter the story, along with all of their own ambiguities and pitfalls. If core drilling is like taking biopsies, geophysics is like putting the hill through a CAT scan. You don't see actual rocks, you see how different parts of the subsurface respond to signals. You send energy in radio waves, electrical current, sound waves, and you measure what comes back. From that, you build pictures, not photographs, models. At Gunung Padang, researchers have used several of the standard tools: ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity surveys, and seismic methods. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, is basically radio echo sounding. You drag an antenna across the ground. It sends short pulses of radio energy down into the soil and rock, and those pulses bounce back when they hit something with a different electrical property, say the boundary between loose soil and compact rock, or between dry rubble and wetter clay. Plot the travel times of those reflections along a line, and you get a radogram, bands and wiggles and bright spots that hint at buried interfaces and objects. Electrical resistivity works differently. You push metal electrodes into the ground. You run a small current between some of them and measure the resulting voltage at others. Different materials conduct electricity differently. Wet clay is conductive, dry rock is resistive, rubble with plenty of air gaps can look very resistive, saturated fractures can look very conductive. By repeating these measurements along profiles and at different electrode spacings, you can invert the data to produce a kind of tomographic image of resistivity with depth. Seismic methods use sound or vibration. You strike the ground or use a small source to send shock waves into the subsurface, then record how fast they travel and how they bend and reflect. Hard, dense rock usually transmits waves faster. Loose, fractured or saturated zones slow them down or scatter them. All of these techniques are incredibly valuable. They found buried walls in Roman towns, graves in Bronze Age cemeteries, voids under city streets, even entire prehistoric landscapes under floodplains. They are standard tools of modern archaeology. They are also, by their nature, ambiguous. In geophysics, the word you hear over and over is anomaly. An anomaly is simply, this spot behaves differently from its surroundings, a strong reflection in GPR. a patch of unusually high resistivity, a low velocity zone in seismic data. It's a place where the signal says, something here is not like the things around it, that something can be almost anything. A stone foundation will show up as an anomaly, so will a buried boulder, so will a root-filled cavity, a dried-out pocket of soil, an old animal burrow, a weathered fracture filled with air, an ancient tree throw, or a small landslide scar infilled with different material. The equipment doesn't label it pyramid or chamber or natural crack. It just tells you different. Interpreting anomalies is where things get tricky, especially in a place like Gunung Padang. Every geophysical method has limits. GPR works best in dry, resistive materials like sand or dry rubble. In wet clays or very conductive soils, the signal dies quickly and you can't see very deep. The frequency you choose is a trade-off. High-frequency radar gives sharp images but only shallow penetration. Lower frequencies see deeper but blur the details. You might get a beautiful reflection at 10 meters and a hazy mess at 20. Electrical resistivity is sensitive to moisture and pore fluids. After heavy rain, the same profile can look very different than in the dry season. A zone that looks like a high resistivity block one day, maybe a wall, can, under different moisture conditions, blend into the background. Rock type matters too. Basalt, especially when fractured and partially weathered, can produce complicated patterns of resistivity that have nothing to do with human activity. Seismic surveys are affected by layering, fractures, loose debris and topography. In a steep volcanic hill, the geometry alone creates all kinds of wave paths and reflections that can easily be misread as tunnels or chambers if you go in wanting to see tunnels or chambers. Signal noise is another problem. Nearby roads, power lines, modern structures, the angle of the slope, even the way the antenna couples to the ground, all of these can introduce artifacts. Patterns that look regular and meaningful can sometimes be the ghost of your survey design, not of the subsurface. Now imagine trying to read all this in a volcanic setting built out of columnar basalt, lava flows and slope failures. Basalt columns like those at Gunung Padang naturally create voids and fractures when they cool and weather. Blocks topple and stack. Spaces between them can stay open, partially filled with soil, or later infilled with different sediments. In geophysical data, a cluster of big, angular boulders with air gaps between them can look very similar to a man-made cavity with a rock ceiling and floor. A natural landslide deposit, jumbled blocks overlying a more compact base, can produce sharp contrasts in radar reflections and resistivity. Those contrasts can line up along a slope, forming a horizon that might be read as a constructed terrace level when it's really the boundary between an old slide and intact rock. Void-like anomalies are especially seductive. A radar shadow, a low-velocity seismic pocket, a strong resistive blob. These are exactly what you'd hope for if you were looking for hidden chambers. But nature makes cavities too. Gas bubbles in volcanic deposits, dissolution features in certain rocks, tree root cavities, old animal dens, or simply piles of boulders with open spaces between them. At Gunung Padang, proponents of the pyramid idea point to anomalies under the hill, zones they interpret as voids, layered interfaces or rectilinear features that could be chambers, retaining walls or stepped construction. They overlay GPR lines, resistivity sections, and seismic data, and see a coherent picture of an engineered interior. Critics look at the same datasets and see the fingerprints of complex geology, cooling joints in basalt, weathered horizons, landslide deposits, and survey artifacts. They argue that in a blocky volcanic hill you should expect lots of weird readings. The burden of proof isn't just to show anomalies, it's to show that those anomalies can't reasonably be explained by known natural processes. So, what would a convincing geophysical case look like? First, repeatability. If a supposed chamber shows up in GPR, you'd want a corresponding signature in resistivity and seismic data at the same location, shape and depth, collected at different times and along different profiles. You'd want that feature to persist when you change equipment settings, survey directions, and processing assumptions. If small changes in method make it appear and disappear, that's a red flag. Second, geometry. Natural features tend to follow the rules of physics. They drape over topography, thicken in depressions, thin over highs, curve and feather out. Human structures tend to impose their own geometry. Straight lines, right angles, flat floors, vertical faces, repeated step heights. A genuinely built interior would likely produce patterns of reflections and resistivity contrasts that are straight, regular, and consistent from profile to profile, not just in isolated cross-sections. Third, ground truthing. Geophysics by itself is never the final answer. It tells you where to look. A strong case requires targeted excavation or coring that physically intersects the anomalies. If the data say void here, you drill or tunnel into that spot and see whether there's actually a chamber, a rubble-filled cavity, or just denser rock framing a softer zone. You document what's really there in 3 dimensions. You compare that to what the models predicted. You adjust your interpretations. Over time, a feedback loop develops. The geophysics guides the digging. The digging calibrates the geophysics. At Gunung Padang, that loop is precisely what's under debate. Have the anomalies been adequately ground-truthed? Were the methods and interpretations published in enough detail for independent teams to replicate them? Do cores and excavations consistently confirm walls, voids, and terraces where the geophysical images say they should be? Or do they turn out to be natural breaks, boulder piles, and soil horizons? Until those questions are answered with transparent, reproducible data, the images of supposed buried structures remain just that, images. Suggestive, intriguing, but not conclusive. And even if the shapes under the hill can be mapped with confidence, that still doesn't tell you how old they are. For that, you need something geophysics can't provide at all. Actual material that can be dated, in context you can trust. That's where radiocarbon enters the story, along with a whole new set of complications. Radiocarbon is one of those words that sounds like it should solve everything. You find something old, you zap it, you get a number, and boom, mystery resolved. That's not how it works. Radiocarbon dating doesn't tell you how old a stone is. It doesn't tell you when a wall was built, when a terrace was levelled, or when a chamber was carved, at least not directly. What it dates is carbon, specifically the radioactive isotope carbon-14, inside once living things. Plants pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Animals eat plants. You eat plants and animals. As long as an organism is alive, it's exchanging carbon with the environment, keeping the amount of carbon-14 in its body roughly in balance with the atmosphere. When it dies, that exchange stops. The carbon-14 already inside begins to decay at a known rate. Measure how much is left, compare it to what you'd expect in a living organism, and you can estimate how long ago it died. So radiocarbon dating gives you the age of organic material. Charcoal, bones, seeds, wood, shell, sometimes even residues stuck to pottery. Not the stone itself. If you want to date a stone's structure, you have to find datable organic material that's linked to that structure in a meaningful way. This is where context becomes everything. Imagine someone burns a campfire on a hillside 30,000 years ago. The charcoal gets buried. 10,000 years later, a landslide moves that soil downslope. Another 5,000 years pass. People build a terrace wall across that disturbed material. If you later dig into the fill behind the wall and pull out a chunk of that ancient charcoal, what does its age tell you? It tells you the wood burned at least 30,000 years ago. It does not, by itself, tell you the wall is 30,000 years old. Charcoal can be older than the construction that traps it. It can be redeposited by erosion, landslides, burrowing animals, or human digging. Older sediments can be cut through, scooped up, and reused as fill. Archaeologists call this reworking. The Radiocarbon lab doesn't know any of that story. It just sees carbon and counts atoms. It will happily give you a very ancient date for that charcoal. Whether that date has anything to do with the terrace is your job to figure out. This is why archaeologists obsess over stratigraphy and careful excavation. You want samples from sealed contexts, places where, as far as you can tell, the material was deposited once and then left undisturbed. A piece of charcoal embedded in the mortar of a wall, locked between stones as they were set, is very different from a crumb of charcoal in loose fill that could have been shoveled in from anywhere. Even then, there are more traps. Contamination is one. Radiocarbon lives in the outermost carbon atoms of a sample. If younger carbon sneaks in, rootlets growing through a layer, humic acids percolating down from the surface, bits of modern plant material sticking to your sample, you can end up with a date that looks too young. Older contamination is rarer, but it happens. Carbonate from ancient limestone can creep into a sample and make it appear older than it really is. Conservation materials, glues, even the way a sample is handled in the field can introduce foreign carbon. Labs do chemical pretreatments to strip away contaminants, but they can't fix a fundamentally bad context. Then there's the old wood problem. Trees can live a long time. If you cut down a 500-year-old tree, burn the heartwood, and leave the charcoal in a layer, that charcoal will give you the age of the inner rings, not the year you lit the fire. In other words, the date of the tree's early life, not its death. If people later scoop up that charcoal and use it in construction, you can end up dating a structure with wood that was already centuries, or even millennia, old when it was burned. Archaeologists try to avoid this by preferring short-lived materials, seeds, twigs, small branches, bone from animals that don't live for centuries. These tend to die and get buried quickly, so their radiocarbon ages are closer to the true event you care about. Even once you have a clean sample from a good context, you still don't get a single neat year. Radiocarbon years are not the same as calendar years. The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has not been perfectly constant over time. It's been tweaked by solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, even human activities in the last few centuries. If you didn't correct for that, your dates would be off by hundreds of years in some periods. To fix this, scientists use calibration curves. They take things whose ages we know independently, tree rings counted year by year, corals with uranium-thorium dates, lake sediments with annual layers, and measure their radiocarbon content. That gives you a map. For each calendar year, what was the apparent radiocarbon age? When you send a sample to a lab, it comes back with a radiocarbon age in years BP before present, defined as 1950 plus an error margin. Then you run that through the calibration curve. The result is a range of possible calendar dates, with probabilities attached. Instead of this charcoal is from 12,000 BC, you'll see something like 95% probability this sample dates between 13,800 and 13,200 calibrated years ago. The wiggly shape of the calibration curve means some ranges are broad, some are narrow, some have multiple possible peaks. It's never as precise as people want it to be in headlines. So how do archaeologists responsibly link these fuzzy, context-dependent dates to actual building phases? They don't just look at one date in isolation. They build a sequence. You dig a terrace. You map the layers. You identify a construction surface, the floor where people walked when the terrace was in use. In that surface you find charcoal from a hearth. Above it you find collapsed debris from the terrace wall. Below it you find natural subsoil. You date multiple samples from each of those layers. You check that the deeper ones tend to date older and the higher ones younger. You watch for outliers that don't fit the pattern. Maybe a root intrusion, maybe reworked material. You use statistical models to build a timeline that respects the stratigraphy. This must be earlier than that. This can't be younger than the material above it. Over time, with enough samples and careful recording, you can tie specific architectural phases to radiocarbon ranges. This terrace was built sometime between X and Y. That wall collapsed after Y but before Z. A later repair phase shows up with younger dates again. When it works, the story you tell about the site and the dates you get from the lab reinforce each other. The radiocarbon doesn't float free. It's anchored to surfaces, cuts, fills and features you can see and touch. At a place like Gunung Padang, where the claim hinges on structures far older than anything else known in Indonesia, this kind of rigor becomes critical. You can always find old carbon in ancient soils. The real question isn't, what is the oldest date on this hill? It's which dates are securely tied to the actual construction of the terraces and any buried features, and which belong to older or younger processes. How researchers at Gunung Padang have answered that question or failed to lies at the heart of the dating controversy. And that's where we're headed next. Once you understand how fragile radiocarbon context is, the numbers coming out of Gunung Padang start to look a lot less like smoking gun evidence and a lot more like the beginning of an argument. Here's what seems to have happened. When the team led by Danny Hillman, Natawajaya and colleagues drilled and excavated into the hill, they didn't just stay in the upper terrace layers we can walk on today. They went deep, several meters down, in soils and breccias and odd-looking zones of sediment between the basalt columns. They pulled out bits of organic material, charcoal, soil carbon, tiny fragments of what used to be plants. They sent those to radiocarbon labs. Some of the results clustered where you might expect for a megalithic site that was already old by the time written history reached Indonesia. A few thousand years ago, maybe nudging back toward the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. That fits pretty comfortably with the idea that the visible terraces are the work of relatively recent farming and ritual communities building on a prominent hill. But other samples, especially from deeper levels, came back with dates that were strange. 10,000 years old, 15,000, 20, even 25,000 years before present in some claims. Numbers that, if you take them at face value as construction dates, would imply people were building sophisticated multi-layered stone monuments in Java at the height of the last ice age, long before agriculture is supposed to have appeared in the region, and long before any comparable architecture is known anywhere in Southeast Asia. That's how the 25,000-year-old pyramid headline was born. But those numbers did not come off a plaque glued to a cut stone. They came from carbon in sediments, in cracked zones between columns, in layers that are not straightforward clean construction surfaces. So we're back to the question from the last section. What is that carbon actually dating? One interpretation, the dramatic one, is that the deep layers are deliberately built structures. In this view, the columnar basalt has been carefully arranged into hidden chambers and retaining walls. The fill between them is man-made, and the charcoal within that fill is part of the original construction. If that's true, then a 20,000-year-old date from deep fill really could mean a 20,000-year-old building phase. A very different interpretation is that those deep layers are mostly natural, weathered volcanic deposits, ancient soils, slope colluvium, material slowly creeping down a hillside for tens of thousands of years. In that scenario, the old carbon is simply old carbon. Forest fires, natural vegetation cycles may be ephemeral human campfires on an open slope long before anyone stacked stones into terraces. Later, when people modified the hill, they cut into and across those pre-existing sediments. If that's what happened, your drill bit can easily pass through a 3,000-year-old terrace and continue down into a 20,000-year-old paleosol. The lab will faithfully report 20,000 years before present. All you've really proven is that the hill has been sitting there, accumulating and reworking organic material since the late Pleistocene. Both stories, ancient construction versus natural deposits, fit the basic fact that deep samples yielded older ages. That's exactly what you would expect in almost any undisturbed landscape. Deeper usually means older. The question is not whether the deep layers are ancient. The question is, are they architecture? This is where extraordinary dates require extraordinary context comes in. If you're going to claim a 25,000-year-old pyramid, you need more than a few isolated old dates from ambiguous sediments. You would want clear, repeated association between architectural features and the dated material. Charcoal embedded in mortar like binding material between placed stones. Burned surfaces that function as floors with walls rising from them. Cut features that demonstrably post-date the surrounding natural layers. Stratigraphic consistency. A stack of dates that make sense, younger in the upper terraces, older in the lower ones, older still in earlier phases, with no wild jumps that can't be explained by reworking or contamination. You'd want multiple samples from the same context agreeing with each other, not single outliers. Replication by independent teams and independent labs. Other archaeologists, using different excavation strategies, sampling protocols and radiocarbon facilities, coming back with the same approximate ranges from the same types of features. Not just reusing the original samples, but taking fresh ones from freshly documented contexts. So far, that's exactly what critics argue is missing. Most of the deep samples with the oldest ages at Gunung Padang come from contexts that are difficult to read. Drill cores, mixed breccias, highly weathered zones, layers that may have been disturbed by water, roots, and gravity for thousands of years. The published descriptions are brief, detailed stratigraphic drawings and photographs that would let other specialists evaluate those contexts are sparse. In some cases, it's not clear whether the charcoal is truly in place or has migrated through cracks and voids. Supporters point to geophysical images that they interpret as hidden chambers and regular shapes, arguing that these show deliberate engineering, therefore the associated deep sediments must be anthropogenic. Skeptics counter that the same signatures can be produced by natural fracturing and weathering of columnar basalt, and that until you expose those supposed chambers and document walls, floors and interfaces by hand, you can't use the physics as proof of construction. None of that subtlety makes it into the headlines. A complex cluster of dates with varying degrees of reliability, context and interpretation is boiled down to a single spectacular number. 25,000-year-old pyramid. The fact that some samples are much younger disappears. The fact that the oldest ones might predate any human modification of the hill is rarely mentioned. The conditional verbs might, could, if get shaved off somewhere between the field report and the news article. So what would actually strengthen the case for the very oldest claims? Carefully excavated open trenches that expose the supposed deep construction layers in plan and section, not just as narrow drill cores. Clear photographs and drawings, showing stones in systematic arrangements, cut interfaces, tool marks, and the precise positions of dated samples. Short-lived organic material, seeds, twigs, small bones, found in direct association with those features, not just bulk soil organics. Multiple labs cross-checking results, including blind retesting. Converging lines of evidence, micromorphology showing trampled floors rather than natural soils, sedimentology consistent with human fill rather than slope deposits, artifacts or cultural residues embedded in the same layers. On the flip side, what would weaken the ancient pyramid reading? If open excavations reveal the deep structures to be fractured but in place bedrock, with no consistent wall faces, no built corners, no contained voids. If the old charcoal is shown to be scattered, root penetrated, or clearly reworked. If further dates from securely architectural contexts all cluster in the late Holocene, while only the ambiguous deep sediments produce Pleistocene ages. In that scenario, the story shifts. Gunung Padang becomes a very old hill with a very long natural history, later transformed by humans, but not a 25,000-year-old pyramid. Right now, the data sit in an uneasy middle ground, enough to tantalize, not enough to convince. And while this argument over numbers and layers is unfolding in technical papers and conference rooms, something else is happening in the background. People are trying to decide what exactly counts as proof that there's a pyramid buried under this hill in the first place. To understand why so many archaeologists remain unconvinced, we have to zoom out from the dates and look at the bigger picture. What would proof of a pyramid actually look like at a site like Gunung Padang? If you ask working archaeologists what would finally settle the pyramid or not question, most of them won't start with radiocarbon at all. They'll start with architecture, not in the vague sense of it kind of looks stepped from a distance, but in the very specific sense of diagnostic features. The kinds of things that, when you uncover them in the ground, make people in hard hats and sunburns look at each other and go, okay, somebody built this. What are those diagnostics? First walls. Real walls. Not just rock layers, not just linear features on a scan, but faces of stone that are straight or consistently curved over meaningful distances. Courses of blocks that are laid with intention, same orientation, similar size ranges, repeated patterns. Corners where those walls meet at stable, non-random angles. Right angles are the dream, but even repeated 70 or 110-degree joints, if they're consistent and mirrored, scream design rather than accident. Second, floors. Architecture sits on something. A constructed monument will usually have surfaces that people walked on, worked on, or performed rituals on. In the ground that often shows up as flat, laterally continuous layers, compacted earth, laid paving stones, trampled surfaces with a distinctive texture under the microscope. You want to see walls rising up from those floors, cutting cleanly across older natural deposits. That intersection, wall on floor, both slicing through earlier geology, is like catching evolution in the act of turning a hill into a building. Third, tool marks. Stones don't usually split themselves into neat, repeated shapes with smooth faces and sharp edges. If humans have been dressing blocks, you'll often find percussion scars from hammerstones, grooves from chisels, pecking patterns that repeat from block to block. Even in a landscape full of columnar basalt, you can usually tell the difference between a surface that broke along a cooling joint and one that's been hammered and trimmed to fit. Fourth, construction sequences. A real monument almost never exists as a single instantaneous event. It has phases, earlier walls under later walls, old staircases that get buried by newer platforms, drainage channels that cut into older fills. Archaeologists live for this kind of stratigraphy because it lets them tell a story. First they built this, later they modified it, then they abandoned or reoccupied it. If Gunung Padang's hill hides a complex multi-layered structure, you'd expect a readable sequence like this somewhere in those depths. And finally, cultural material. If thousands of people spent years or generations building and using a big stone monument, they don't magically leave no trace except the stones. You'd anticipate tools broken and discarded in the fill. Potsherds, food waste, charcoal from hearths that clearly belong to living surfaces, not just random flecks in mixed sediments, ornament fragments, anything that ties the stonework to a human community, with styles that can be compared to other sites. That's why archaeologists get nervous when claims hinge on a few intriguing scans and some old carbon from ambiguous sediments. But there are no clear walls, no floors, no tool marks, no artifacts being documented in place. Because in this field, how something is found matters at least as much as what is found. Controlled excavation is the backbone of that how. It means you open areas systematically, record each layer as you go, map every feature in 3 dimensions, and bag samples with exact coordinates and context notes. Layer by layer, association by association. When you do that, a charred seed in a hearth on a floor bounded by walls becomes a powerful piece of evidence. When you don't, a charred seed from somewhere in a dark drill core at 15 meters is just a number waiting to be misinterpreted. Documentation is what lets anyone else check your work. Drawings of stratigraphic sections, plans showing how stones relate to each other, detailed descriptions of each context. Without that, even the most spectacular finds remain isolated objects floating in interpretive space. Then there's the social side of science: peer review, transparency, and independent verification. Peer review, at its best, is not some shadowy conspiracy to suppress weird ideas. It's a quality filter. You submit your methods, your data, your interpretations to a journal. Other specialists, people who've spent their lives staring at soil profiles and stone tools, go through it, looking for gaps, alternative explanations, untested assumptions. They push back. They ask for more detail. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they find real problems. Either way, the claims that survive this process are usually stronger. Data transparency means making enough of your raw material. Photos, drawings, sample lists, lab reports, available that others can reanalyze, and if necessary disagree with you in an informed way. It's one thing to say we found a wall. It's another to show the section drawing, the plan, the close-ups of the contact between that wall and the surrounding deposits. Independent verification is the final boss. If a different team goes in, opens their own trenches, samples their own contexts, and comes back with the same kinds of walls, the same construction sequences, and similar dates, confidence skyrockets. If, instead, they don't see your walls or their dates all cluster in much younger zones or their micromorphology says natural soil, then the extraordinary claim starts to wobble. All of this feeds into a subtle but crucial distinction that gets lost once the story hits YouTube thumbnails. The difference between possible, plausible, and demonstrated. Possible is a huge category. Could Gunung Padang conceal very ancient construction? In a raw, logical sense, yes, it doesn't violate any physical law. Lots of things are possible. Plausible is narrower. It asks, does this claim fit comfortably with what we already know about human history, regional archaeology, geology? A late Holocene terraced sanctuary on a volcanic hilltop in West Java is very plausible. We already know those exist. A highly engineered 25,000-year-old multi-tier pyramid would be revolutionary. Not impossible, but it would require us to rethink almost everything about the timing and geography of complex construction. That pushes it toward the edge of the plausible spectrum, where the burden of proof gets very heavy. Demonstrated is where archaeology tries to live. It means there are multiple converging lines of evidence, documented in ways that other specialists can scrutinize and, ideally, replicate. Demonstrated doesn't mean 100% certain for all time. It means supported strongly enough that for now this is the best explanation we have. So what would it take to move Gunung Padang from possible ancient pyramid to demonstrated ancient monument, or to confidently park it in the modified natural hill category? You'd want a research program designed from the ground up to answer that question, not just to generate dramatic headlines. One approach might look like this. First, targeted, open-area excavations in places where geophysics suggests regular subsurface features. Instead of just drilling, you cut wide trenches that expose meters of stone and sediment in plan and profile. You map every column, every apparent wall face, every contact. Second, you bring in a full suite of analytical techniques on those exposed profiles. Micromorphology samples from suspected floors and fills. Sedimentology to distinguish dump deposits from natural slope processes. Detailed recording of any tool marks or shaped stones, with experimental comparisons to natural fracturing. Third, you implement a strict sampling strategy for dating. Prioritize short-lived organics firmly embedded in clearly architectural contexts. Multiple samples from the same layer, sent to different labs, some of them blind. You build a Bayesian model of the stratigraphy, and dates so you can test whether the phases really line up the way a construction sequence would require. Fourth, you invite outside teams, local and international, to participate, observe, or at least have full access to the raw data. You make interim reports public, with enough detail that critics can't just say, "Trust us, it's a pyramid," or "Trust us, it's just geology," without engaging with the actual evidence. If that kind of program uncovers deep, unambiguous walls rising from prepared floors, with Pleistocene age dates tightly tied to those construction surfaces and a few artifacts to boot, the ancient pyramid hypothesis suddenly moves from fringe to serious contender. If, instead, it reveals beautifully columnar, but essentially in-place bedrock, natural soil horizons with old charcoal, and all the clear architecture clustering in younger upper levels, then the story shifts decisively toward a different, but still fascinating conclusion. Either way, the mystery doesn't vanish. It evolves. Because even if Gunung Padang turns out not to be a 25,000-year-old pyramid, there's still the question of what people actually did build there on the terraces we can see, with the stones we can touch, in the time frames that the evidence really supports. And that's where we turn next. Let's start with the most boring-sounding explanation, because in science those are often the ones that quietly win. Gunung Padang might not be a buried, purpose-built stone pyramid at all. It might be a volcanic hill that people have been modifying, terracing and reusing for a very long time. Not as dramatic as lost Ice Age civilization, but if you take it seriously, this model actually explains a lot of what we see without asking for a civilization that appears out of nowhere and leaves almost nothing behind. Think of it as a layer cake built on a rock core. At the base, you have geology doing what geology does, a volcanic cone or dome made largely of columnar basalt. Those neat hexagonal columns didn't come out of some ancient quarry system. They formed when lava cooled and cracked. Over tens of thousands of years, erosion, landslides, and soil formation reshaped that mass into the rounded hill we see today. Then people showed up. Not one mysterious master culture in a single year, but multiple communities across centuries and millennia, each adding, repairing, and sometimes wrecking what was already there. Maybe the first builders just leveled a small platform on a shoulder of the hill, clearing stones, stacking some into low retaining walls, arranging others upright as markers or seats. Later groups expanded those terraces, cut new ones lower down, refaced old walls, dumped fill to raise ritual spaces, and dragged more columns a few meters from wherever they lay loose on the slope. Over time, that repeated use does something powerful to the landscape. You start with a natural hill. You end with a sacred terrace complex that still mostly follows the shape of that hill, but now has flat steps, revetment walls, stone alignments, and buried construction fills that look in cross-section, far messier than a clean architectural diagram. From the surface, you see order, rows of columns, clear terrace edges, deliberate arrangements. Inside, you get a tangle. Intact bedrock in some places, dumped stones and soil in others, old surfaces buried by later fills, pockets, where people scooped out pits or dug small chambers, and all of it overprinted by roots, animal burrows, landslides, and creeping soil. This is what archaeologists mean by a modified natural formation, not a fake pyramid, not just a hill, a partnership between geology and human behaviour. In that model, the basalt columns are key, but not magical. You don't need a vast underground quarry or precision stone industry. You need people who notice that the hill they live near is already shedding ready-made, column-shaped blocks. Cooling joints crack, weathering loosens stones, gravity rolls them down slope. All a community has to do is pry them loose, break a few to size, and drag them short distances to where they're needed. Some will be set upright as menhirs or supports. Others will be laid horizontally in rough courses. Many will just be tossed into terrace fills as handy packing material. That alone can create the illusion of deep stone architecture. If you later send radar waves and electric currents into that hill, those same columns, some still in place, some tumbled, some stacked by humans, will show up as linear reflectors and blocky anomalies. From a distance, those patterns can look like buried walls or voids, even when they're just columns sitting more or less where cooling and gravity left them. Add erosion and soil movement to the mix, and the picture gets even trickier. Hill slopes creep down slope over time. Heavy rains mobilize fine sediments that wash into gaps between stones, filling cavities and leaving others partially open. Tree roots lever rocks apart. When those trees die and rot, they leave vertical tubes that can show up in geophysical data as mysterious vertical features. Natural processes love to create horizontals and verticals. Layered soils and volcanic ash can form apparently flat floors. Stonefalls can pile in ways that mimic stepped edges. Differential weathering can leave harder zones that look like deliberate plinths or benches, while softer zones erode away to form apparent chambers under a more resistant cap. From the ground, from a distance, from a scan, you can convince yourself you're seeing architecture deep in the hill. But unless you open it up and see stones bonded, coursed, and tied into real construction, you might just be reading intention into pattern. The modified hill model doesn't deny that people built at Gunung Padang. It actually depends on it. It says, yes, there are terraces and walls and arrangements of stones. Yes, there may be multiple phases of building, but the engineering is mostly skin deep, hugging and exploiting a pre-existing volcanic shape rather than hiding some gigantic, wholly artificial core. That idea leads to specific, testable predictions. If Gunung Padang is primarily a natural hill with cultural veneers, you'd expect intact, in-place columnar basalt at depth, showing the regular jointing patterns of cooling lava rather than the irregular, interlocking patterns of constructed masonry. Terraces that thin out laterally and feather into natural slope deposits, instead of continuous, sharply bounded platforms wrapping the entire hill in neat geometric tiers. Construction fills composed of reworked local material, angular columns, mixed soils, occasional artifacts, all jumbled, not carefully graded, and sorted like the fill you see in big engineered pyramids. Old radiocarbon dates mostly coming from natural or mixed sediments, not from clear architectural surfaces or sealed construction layers. Cultural features hearths, concentrations of artifacts, shaped stones with tool marks, clustered mainly in the upper meters, tapering off with depth as you transition from human-modified zones into untouched geology. The pyramid model, in contrast, predicts something else. Deep, continuous walls independent of the bedrock, large voids with clear artificial boundaries, and Pleistocene age activity securely tied to those architectural elements. Both models can accommodate terraces, stones, and even some intriguing anomalies in the scans. The question is, which one best fits the fine-grained ground truth data once careful excavation and analysis are done? Right now, the modified hill hypothesis doesn't get splashy headlines. But it's the one that lines up cleanly with what we already know about volcanic landscapes, sacred hills, and the way human communities tend to build on, not against, the bones of the land. In the next section, we'll zoom in on the people we can actually see in the record, the builders who shaped the visible terraces, and ask who they were when they lived, and what this hill meant to them. So let's bring this back down from geophysics and lava columns to something more human. If Gunung Padang is a natural hill that's been repeatedly modified, then the first question isn't who built the 25,000-year-old pyramid. It's much simpler and much more answerable: who built the terraces we can actually see? To get at that, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger cultural landscape of Indonesia. Because if you look across the archipelago, the idea of cutting steps into slopes, of turning hillsides into layered platforms for ritual or farming, is not unusual at all. It's practically a regional obsession. Fast forward in time to periods we know better: the first millennium BCE, the early centuries CE, the later classical era of Java and Sumatra. What do you see? Terraces everywhere. You see rice terraces climbing mountain flanks in West Java and Bali, maintained by complex irrigation societies. You see terraced temple complexes like Borobudur and Candi Suku, monumental stone platforms stacked in receding levels, each terrace a stage for ritual movement, offerings, processions. Of course, Gunung Padang is much older than Borobudur. Nobody is claiming the same dynasty marched up and carved both. But the underlying logic, sacred space expressed as steps on a slope, accessed by paths and stairways, bounded by retaining walls, is the same grammar, spoken in different dialects across thousands of years. Archaeologists working in West Java and the broader Sunda region see a pattern. From at least the late Neolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages, people were building megalithic sites. Standing stones, stone benches, dolmens, terraced platforms, often on hilltops or ridgelines with good views and symbolic weight. Some of these are surprisingly modest. A few courses of stone, a small levelled platform, a ring of uprights. Others, like Gunung Padang, are more elaborate, but they belong to a long tradition of what scholars sometimes call Austronesian megalithism and terraced sanctuaries, outdoor ritual spaces shaped by communal labour, used and reused over generations. In that world, nobody needed a pharaoh or an emperor to order a pyramid. You needed something much more common: a village, a shared belief that the hill mattered, and a cultural habit of gathering to move stones. Imagine what that actually looked like on the ground. You don't see slaves in chains or giant ramps stretching for miles. You see extended families, kin groups, ritual specialists. You see communal work days, feasts, marking the completion of a terrace face. Elders telling stories about ancestors who first opened the hill. In the archaeology, that kind of activity leaves certain fingerprints. If you strip away the headlines and just ask, what would we expect to find if a community in, say, the last 5,000 or 6,000 years built and used these terraces? The answers are familiar. You'd expect hearths or fire pits on or adjacent to flat surfaces, places where people cooked, burned offerings, or simply kept warm during ceremonies. Charcoal and burnt bone in those hearths, giving datable material tied to specific use surfaces. Pottery sherds, broken vessels from food, drink, or offerings, even if the ceramics are coarse and undecorated. Stone tools and debitage, flakes from shaping basalt, hammerstones, grinding stones, the everyday kit of people working stone and preparing food. Ecofacts, animal bones, seeds, nutshells, phytoliths, pollen, all the tiny biological traces of what people ate, burned and trampled into the soil. Modified stones with clear tool marks, pecking, dressing, notches for fitting, maybe even carved symbols or grooves. On a living, changing sacred hill, you'd also expect a mess. Not a single pristine construction horizon, but layered floors, resurfacing episodes, old walls cut by new walls, offerings dug into earlier fills, pits cut into terrace edges, areas that go quiet for a while, then come back to life centuries later. That's what the human story at Gunung Padang probably looks like in real time. Pulses of activity tied to cultural phases we already know existed in Indonesia. Late Neolithic farmers experimenting with crops and stone ritual. Bronze Age communities exchanging metal tools and ornaments along maritime trade routes. Early historic groups, already in contact with Indianized kingdoms elsewhere in Java, may be reinterpreting an old hill through new religious lenses. All of these are plausible candidates for at least some of the terraces we see today. And it doesn't have to be just one of them. The temptation is always to ask, who built it? As if there was a single founding event, a single original culture that did the real work and everyone after just visited the ruins. But sacred landscapes don't work like that. They accrete. A plateau first chosen as a burial ground might, centuries later, become a council place. A stone alignment that once pointed to a particular star or solstice sunrise might be half forgotten. Its stones reused to shore up a sagging terrace edge. A shrine built by one group might be claimed, renamed, and ritually conquered by newcomers who fold it into their own cosmology. Gunung Padang, in this view, doesn't have one builder. It has many. Early communities might have done the heavy lifting of cutting the topmost terraces, dragging the most obvious columns into place. Later groups might have refaced those walls, added stairways, cleared vegetation, and carried in portable offerings. Even later still, local villagers in the last few hundred years might have moved stones, repaired paths, and redefined the site as part of an Islamic or syncretic sacred geography. Each wave leaves traces. Some we can already see, the surface terraces, the standing stones, the scatter of artifacts from the last few thousand years. Some are still buried in the fills and soils between those stones, waiting for careful excavation. When archaeologists sample charcoal from a hearth cut into a terrace surface and get a date of, say, 2,500 or 3,000 years ago, that doesn't tell us when the hill first became meaningful. It tells us when that particular surface was in active use. Older use might lie a few centimetres below. Younger modifications might sit right above. The point is not to crown a single culture as the true builder. It's to map a chain of custody, from Neolithic villagers to Bronze Age ritualists, from early historic polities to modern local communities. Gunung Padang has likely been passed from hand to hand, story to story, each generation adding a layer of stone, a new path, a different prayer. When you frame it that way, the mystery doesn't disappear. It just shifts. Instead of asking which lost civilization built this entire pyramid 25,000 years ago, we start asking, how did real knowable cultures across Indonesian history use and reshape this hill? And that question is one we can actually answer with trowels, microscopes, and radiocarbon dates. In the next section, we'll step out of the trenches and into the story's myths, legends, and modern beliefs to see how people themselves have explained this strange stone hill and why places like Gunung Padang feel so ancient even before a single scan or date is taken. If you ask people who live around Gunung Padang who built it, you don't get talk of late Neolithic phases or Bronze Age megalithism, you get stories. One common thread in those stories is this: the hill is old, older than anyone can remember, older than any kingdom. Sometimes older than Islam, older than Hindu Buddhist Java, older than everything. Not 25,000 years old, just old in the way only memory can make something old. In Sundanese tradition, Gunung Padang has long been regarded as a sacred place. A karamat, a spot where the boundaries between worlds feel thinner. Some local narratives link it to legendary kings or heroes. Others say powerful spirits dwell there. Some stories claim it was used by great figures of the past for meditation, for receiving inspiration, for communicating with unseen forces. Different villages, different storytellers, different details, but the same underlying claim: this hill matters. It has always mattered. Sacred status can do something remarkable to a landscape. It can preserve it. You don't need continuous written records to keep a place alive in cultural memory. You need parents taking children up the path saying, "This is where our ancestors prayed." You need taboos about quarrying stone from that slope. You need rituals tied to planting, harvest, or healing that require a visit to the old stones. Do that for a few generations, and a site becomes traditional. Do it for a few hundred years, and it becomes ancestral. Do it for 1,000 or two, and it feels primordial, timeless, beyond history, even if the actual terraces were finished in what archaeologists would still call recent prehistory. That's one of the strange powers of oral tradition. It doesn't keep track of exact dates. It doesn't say in 1200 BCE a group of Austronesian farmers cut this terrace. It collapses generations into archetypes, the ancestors, the old people, the great king, the holy man. So a sanctuary used since, say, 2,500 years ago can, in living memory, be from the time of the ancestors, with no meaningful distinction between 2,500 years and 25,000 years. Both are just before us. Both are unimaginably far away. Both are ancient now. Layer onto that the psychology of the place itself. Humans are weirdly sensitive to certain shapes in the landscape. A lone hill with a flattened top. A long ridgeline with a sharp profile. A mountain that looks like a reclining figure, or a face, or a staircase. Gunung Padang has that kind of silhouette, approached from certain angles. It looks deliberate even if you never see a single basalt column. Terraces step up the slope. Lines break the natural curves. It suggests order, design, intent. We are tuned to see that. Our ancestors spent millions of years scanning horizons for patterns. The line of a cliff, the break in a forest, a cluster of stones that might hide predators or shelter. Our visual systems and our storytelling brains evolved together. When we see a hill that looks like a platform, our minds reflexively ask, platform for what? For whom? So mystery hills crop up again and again in human cultures. In Britain, rounded mounds became burial barrows of mythical kings and warriors. In Japan, keyhole-shaped Kofun tombs turned into focal points for imperial myth. In Mesoamerica, even natural hills were sometimes reworked just enough to align with cosmological ideas, then wrapped in stories about gods and founders. Gunung Padang fits that pattern, a prominent high point with an unusual shape. A place you can see from a distance, a place that invites narrative even before we know anything about who did what, when. Here's where we have to be careful, though. Cultural depth is not the same thing as chronological depth. A site can feel unimaginably old because it has been woven into layer after layer of belief, ritual, and story. Because people have been climbing it, whispering prayers on it, and warning children about offending its spirits for longer than anyone can remember. That doesn't automatically mean the stonework dates back to the last ice age. When someone from a nearby village says, "This place has been sacred forever," that might mean, since my grandfather's grandfather's time, or since the old kingdom that ruled this valley, or since the age of the great heroes in our stories, not since 25,000 BCE. Oral time is symbolic time, not radiocarbon time. And yet those stories matter. They matter for understanding why the site is preserved at all, why the stones are still there to study, why the hill wasn't flattened for agriculture, or quarried away to build a road, or ignored into oblivion. They also matter because modern narratives don't appear in a vacuum. In Indonesia today, Gunung Padang sits at a crossroads of folklore, nationalism and global curiosity. On one side, you have long-standing local beliefs, the hill as sacred, as a place of power, as part of a regional sacred geography that includes other Keramat springs, peaks and stones. On another, you have a nation forging its identity, proud of Borobudur, of Srivijaya and Majapahit, of ancient maritime networks. The idea that Indonesia might also host the world's oldest pyramid is powerfully attractive. It says, our ancestors weren't just participants in global history, they were pioneers. Then you have global alternative history narratives, YouTube videos, TV specials and bestsellers that love mystery, especially when it involves lost civilizations and suppressed truths. For that audience, Gunung Padang becomes part of a larger story about advanced Ice Age builders, global cataclysms and forgotten knowledge. Those three currents, local sacred meaning, national pride, and international mystery-seeking, can blend into a single modern story. This hill is not just old. It is unimaginably ancient, built by a forgotten civilization, ignored by closed-minded scientists. Once that story takes hold, it can feed back into local identity. A villager who grew up hearing that the hill was sacred may now also hear that it's 25,000 years old and think, of course. Our elders always said it was older than any kingdom. The mythic sense of age gets assigned a specific number, borrowed from headlines rather than from tradition. So, how do we navigate that? By doing two things at once. First, by taking local meaning seriously, recognizing that to nearby communities, Gunung Padang is not primarily a puzzle about radiocarbon dates. It's a living sacred place woven into prayers, taboos, pilgrimages, and personal histories. Excavation and research there aren't just technical projects, they touch on identity and faith. Second, by keeping our scientific standards intact. Respecting stories doesn't mean turning them into data they were never meant to be. A legend about a great king praying on a hill doesn't become evidence that a pyramid under that hill is 25,000 years old. A sense of timelessness doesn't override what the stratigraphy and the lab results actually show. The challenge and the opportunity is to let both levels coexist. We can acknowledge that Gunung Padang feels ancient because it sits at the intersection of geology, long-term ritual use, and deep cultural memory. We can honour the people who have kept it alive as a sacred place, and at the same time we can insist that extraordinary chronological claims require extraordinary archaeological evidence. In the next section, we'll see what happens when those two worlds, local meaning and scientific method, collide in public, how academics, officials and media all got pulled into a controversy that turned one hill into a global battleground over what counts as proof. When the Gunung Padang controversy really kicked off, it didn't start with YouTube videos or Netflix specials. It started with something much less glamorous: abstracts, technical reports and conference talks. The team proposing extreme antiquity for the site didn't just shout 25,000-year-old pyramid into the void. They presented geophysical results, suggesting layered structures. They circulated radiocarbon dates from deep drill cores. They argued in fairly standard academic language that the hill might contain man-made arrangements and cultural layers far older than the visible terraces. But here's how real scientific disagreement actually unfolds. Step one is almost always someone publishes or presents a claim. Step 2. Other specialists read it, squint at the methods, and start asking pointed questions. Those questions don't usually appear in front-page headlines. They show up in peer review reports, email threads, and tense but polite exchanges at conferences. In the case of Gunung Padang, the criticisms clustered around a few big themes. First, dating context. Radiocarbon doesn't date a structure. It dates the material you put in the machine. Charcoal in a core, organic bits in a soil sample, dissolved carbon in a carbonate crust. So when the proponents said, "We have dates around 25,000 years from deep inside the hill," skeptical archaeologists immediately asked, what exactly was dated? Where was it in the stratigraphy? Could that material have moved downwards through cracks? Is it clearly associated with human activity, or could it be natural, without tight context, clear layers, clear association with artifacts or construction features? Radiocarbon dates become suggestive at best, meaningless at worst. Second, interpretation leaps. Geophysical surveys are powerful. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, seismic tomography. They can all show you contrasts in density, moisture, and material beneath the surface. What they can't do by themselves is tell you this is a pyramid. They show patterns, horizontal reflectors, high resistivity blocks, anomalous voids. Turning those patterns into chambers, retaining walls, or stepped platforms requires interpretation. And from the outside, many archaeologists felt the Gunung Padang interpretations jumped too fast from anomalous structure to engineered structure to Ice Age megastructure. Third, insufficient excavation proof. In archaeology, the gold standard isn't a radar image. It's a trench. If you think there's an ancient wall, you ground truth it. You dig down, expose the stones, map them, document tool marks, mortar, associated ceramics, everything. You show layer by layer how that feature sits in the surrounding sediments. Critics argued that at Gunung Padang, the subsurface claims outpaced the actual exposures. Yes, there were drill cores and some test excavations. But for claims this extraordinary, many specialists wanted large, carefully documented sections showing clear, unequivocal human construction deep in the hill, something that could be independently inspected, not just inferred. On the other side, the research team and their supporters weren't just hand-waving. They pointed to the convergence of multiple methods, geophysics hinting at ordered structures, core samples showing arranged stone fragments rather than chaotic rubble, anomalous cavities, and those contentious radiocarbon dates from depth. Their argument went something like this. When different lines of evidence all nudge in the same direction, you don't ignore them just because the conclusion is uncomfortable. You investigate more, you fund bigger excavations. You bring in a broader team. You don't shut the door by saying, "That can't be true, therefore it isn't." They also raised a very practical point: money. Deep, meticulous excavation of a large hill is expensive. So is bringing in international specialists, running high-resolution geophysical surveys, paying for dozens or hundreds of radiocarbon dates, and funding years of field seasons. From their perspective, some of the same people dismissing the Ice Age pyramid idea were also sitting on the committees that decide who gets research grants. You can see how mistrust starts to grow. Add one more accelerant: public statements. Some members of the team went to the media with bold claims before the dust had settled in the journals. World's oldest pyramid. Proof of advanced Ice Age civilization. History will be rewritten. To them, this was about excitement, national pride, and rallying support for further study. To many archaeologists watching, it felt like leapfrogging the slow, painful process of peer review and public scrutiny. like taking preliminary contested results and selling them as settled fact. And so the feedback loop began. Big claims generated big headlines. Big headlines triggered sharper academic pushback. Sharper pushback fed stories about closed-minded or jealous scientists suppressing new ideas. That in turn made some in the mainstream even more wary of engaging, because nobody likes being cast as the villain in someone else's narrative. From the outside, this kind of argument can look like pure mystery. One group of experts says, something huge is buried here and it's unimaginably old. Another group of experts says, your data don't show what you think they show. To a viewer scrolling past articles and videos, it can feel like a standoff between brave mavericks and stodgy gatekeepers, or between science and conspiracy, depending on which story you prefer. But under the noise, there's more agreement than you might think. Both sides, broadly speaking, acknowledge that Gunung Padang is archaeologically important. The visible terraces are human-made and culturally significant. The subsurface structure of the hill is complex and worth investigating. More data, better excavations, more transparent reporting, carefully contextualized dating would be valuable. Where they diverge is on pace and proof. One camp says, the hints are strong enough to justify radical chronological claims right now. The other says, the hints are interesting, but extraordinary claims have to wait for extraordinary evidence. Strip away the personalities, the politics, and the headlines. And that's the core of the controversy. Not whether the hill matters, it does, but how far we're justified in stretching the story on the basis of the evidence we have. In the next section, we'll step out of the conference halls and into the click-driven world of modern media, and see how that nuanced technical dispute got boiled down into a single irresistible headline, 25,000-year-old pyramid, found in Indonesia. So how do you get from that messy technical argument to 25,000-year-old pyramid writes history? You don't need a conspiracy. You just need the modern information ecosystem doing exactly what it's designed to do. Think about how most people first hear about a site like Gunung Padang. It's not by reading a 40-page PDF on resistivity tomography. It's a headline in a news feed, a thumbnail with glowing lines under a hill, a narrator saying, archaeologists are baffled. Those headlines follow a script. First move, find the superlative. Not interesting stepped hill in West Java, but world's oldest pyramid. Not unusual subsurface anomalies, but mysterious hidden chambers. Not radiocarbon dates raise questions, but proof that civilization is 20,000 years older than we thought. Oldest first, hidden, secret, rewrite. These are trigger words. They tell your brain, this is not just another site. This is a plot twist in the story of humanity. The second move is simplification. All the nuance about dating context, geophysics, and alternative interpretations gets compressed into a single, clean claim. Scientists find 25,000-year-old pyramid in Indonesia. Full stop. No mention that many scientists strongly disagree. No asterisk saying, according to one team's controversial interpretation, no space for, this might be a natural hill with later modifications. It's not that journalists are evil masterminds. They're under pressure. Their editors want clicks. Their advertisers want attention. Their metrics reward stories that spread fast, not stories that carefully explain why the data are ambiguous. Documentary producers face a similar problem. You have 45 minutes to tell a story. You can't spend 20 of them unpacking the finer points of soil micromorphology. So you pick a protagonist, you pick an antagonist, and you frame the site as the battlefield. On one side, bold researchers daring to question orthodoxy. On the other, skeptical gatekeepers trying to shut them down. It's a clean narrative. It promises drama. It keeps people watching to the end. But it also does something subtle and dangerous. It turns disagreement about evidence into a morality play. If you like the idea of ancient lost civilizations, your heroes are the mavericks. If you identify with science, your heroes are the critics. Each audience gets a version of the story that flatters their worldview. And the more polarized the audience, the stronger the incentive to dial up the certainty. Saying this might be the oldest pyramid doesn't move the needle. Saying this is the oldest pyramid and mainstream archaeology is terrified does. Once that framing takes hold, it's hard to walk back. Any future excavations that don't immediately produce stone chambers at 25,000 years deep can be spun as a cover-up. Any cautious statement from a university archaeologist can be edited to sound dismissive or fearful. Uncertainty starts to look, from the outside, like evasion. She says we don't know yet. She must be hiding something. But in science, we don't know yet is often the most honest, courageous sentence you can say. Look at Gunung Padang through that lens. An honest media line would sound something like, there's a complex hill with clear human terraces on top, geophysical anomalies inside, and some scattered deep dates whose meaning is contested. A few researchers think this points to Ice Age construction. Most think the evidence doesn't support that yet. More work is needed. That's less thrilling than 25,000-year-old pyramid found, but it's a lot closer to reality. So how do you, as a viewer, navigate this? You're not going to get a PhD in geophysics before you click on a video. But you can build a simple filter. Questions you ask yourself whenever you see a sensational archaeology claim. Start with methods. Does the story tell you how the claim was made? Not just scientists say, but based on radiocarbon dates from X, or from GPR images that show Y, or from actual excavated walls with tool marks and artifacts. If there's no method, just a headline and a confident voice, that's a red flag. Next, context. Do they explain what was dated, what was measured, what exactly was found? Or is it just, we got a date of 25,000 years from deep inside the hill, with no discussion of how that material could have gotten there, or how it relates to visible structures? Real archaeology lives and dies on context, then replication and independent input. Have these results been published where other experts can critique them? Are other teams working at the site or planning to? Do you hear from multiple specialists who disagree with each other, or only from people who already buy into the most extreme interpretation? If everyone in the show conveniently agrees, especially on something that rewrites history, be suspicious. Also look at how the story handles doubt. Do they quote critics fairly, actually engaging with their arguments? Or do they just frame them as closed-minded, afraid, or protecting their careers? The moment a documentary starts psychologizing its opponents instead of addressing their data, you're not watching science anymore. You're watching propaganda for a preferred narrative. Finally ask, what would change their mind? If the answer seems to be nothing, if every new piece of evidence is spun to support the same conclusion, that's a problem. In real research, claims are provisional. They shift as new data arrive. People retract, revise, and sometimes abandon their favourite ideas. You should be more inclined to trust someone who says, here's what I think, here's why, here's what could prove me wrong, than someone who announces, this discovery forces us to accept X, before the dust has even settled on the excavation. Gunung Padang is a perfect test case. You can watch how different outlets talk about it and practice this checklist in real time. Who tells you what's actually been dug versus what's inferred from scans? Who explains the dating controversy instead of skipping straight to oldest pyramid? Who admits where the evidence is thin, or where multiple interpretations are still on the table? If you start listening for those differences, you'll notice something. The most careful, honest accounts sound less like a movie trailer and more like an unfinished story. They leave space for surprise. They allow for the possibility that, after another decade of work, Gunung Padang might turn out to be less than 10,000 years old, or that it might reveal something genuinely shocking about how early humans in Indonesia shaped their landscape. In the next section, we'll follow that second possibility to its logical extreme. If the most dramatic version of the claim were true, if there really were a 25,000-year-old pyramid buried in this hill, what would that actually mean for the story of our species? And what kind of evidence would we need to even begin to take that seriously? To even imagine Gunung Padang as a 25,000-year-old pyramid, you have to rewind the world to that moment in time. 25,000 years ago, Earth was near the peak of the last ice age. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower. Huge ice sheets smothered Canada, Scandinavia, and parts of northern Europe and Asia. Environments shifted southward. In many places, what is now forest was open grassland. What is now coastline was dry land. Indonesia was different, but it wasn't tropical paradise as usual. Because sea levels were so low, many of the islands we know today were joined together. Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula formed a single vast landmass called Sundaland. Rivers flowed across plains that are now underwater. Coastlines were tens of kilometers farther out, and humans were there. We have stone tools, butchered animal bones, and later cave art scattered across Southeast Asia and Australia that show Homo sapiens had reached and settled this region tens of thousands of years earlier. But what did their lives look like at 25,000 years ago, everywhere on Earth that we can currently see clearly in the archaeological record? Humans are still hunter-gatherers. Some are incredibly sophisticated hunter-gatherers. They manage landscapes with fire. They create art on cave walls. They make tailored clothing, composite tools, fishing gear and, in a few places, very early structures. We do see glimmers of architecture. In Siberia, people build ring-shaped structures out of mammoth bones. In parts of Europe and the Near East, we find stone and bone foundations that hint at semi-permanent dwellings. In the Levant, you start to see more intensive use of wild grains. People are settling in for longer stretches of the year. But there is nothing like a true stone monument yet. No massive dressed blocks, no carefully engineered terraces rising in long, regular steps up a hillside, no deliberate 100-meter scale reshaping of a landscape in stone. The best-known monumental sites we have, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Jericho's Stone Tower, the earliest large platform mounds in the Americas, cluster in a later window, roughly 12,000 to 9,000 years ago and after. That's already shockingly early for big stone architecture. It pushed archaeologists to rethink how quickly complex ritual and social organization could appear. Now double that age. If there really were a purpose-built large-scale stone pyramid under Gunung Padang at 25,000 years old, it wouldn't just nudge the timeline. It would leapfrog every known case of monumental building by more than 10,000 years. It would mean that while Ice Age hunters in Europe were painting mammoths on cave walls, and while small bands in the Near East were just starting to experiment with staying put, someone in Sunda was organizing labor on a scale we usually associate with Neolithic societies and early states. Think about what that implies. To build something that big in stone, you need more than hands and rocks. You need planning. Somebody has to design it. You need a mental blueprint, a sense of geometry, sequences of construction, drainage, stability, coordination. You need to assemble and feed a lot of people in one place for extended periods. That means surplus food, or at least very reliable food. You need leaders, organizers, or ritual authorities that other people are willing to listen to. Technical knowledge, you need to know how stone behaves. how to quarry, shape, move and fit blocks, how to stabilize slopes, how to build in stages without the whole thing collapsing. Symbolism. Nobody moves that much stone just for fun. A structure on that scale almost certainly encodes beliefs about ancestors, spirits, the cosmos. It's a social and religious project, not just an engineering one. All of that 25,000 years ago would be extraordinary. Not impossible in a physical sense. Humans then had the same basic brains we do now, but extraordinary in terms of what we currently see in the archaeological record. Which brings us to the crucial question. If such a thing really existed, what footprint would it leave? Stone on a hill is not enough. Natural processes can mimic order. Basalt columns can stack themselves. Erosion can make terraces. Geophysics can be ambiguous. To seriously entertain a 25,000-year-old pyramid, we'd need converging lines of evidence, all pointing to intentional human construction at that depth and that age. First, tools. Not just a couple of flakes or a random stone blade in a core sample, but a clear, dense toolkit associated with the proposed construction level. Shaped hammerstones with impact wear from quarrying, chisels or wedges with characteristic fractures, debitage, the waste chips and flakes you get from dressing stone, lying in coherent layers or work areas. If you move thousands of tons of rock, you leave thousands of traces of the tools that did it. Second, habitation layers. Where did the builders live? Where did they cook, sleep, bury their dead? At other monumental sites, you don't just get the monument. You get surrounding activity. Hearths, post holes, middens full of broken tools and animal bones, layers of charcoal, ash and trampled earth. If a big structure at Gunung Padang was truly 25,000 years old, we'd expect to find Ice Age occupation horizons somewhere on or near the hill, layers that consistently date to that period, with artifacts, food remains, maybe even burials. Third, a cultural footprint beyond one hill. Monuments don't usually appear in total isolation. They grow out of traditions. Even Göbekli Tepe, which seemed bizarrely unique at first, is now set in a broader landscape of early ritual sites and special purpose enclosures in the region. For Gunung Padang, that would mean other sites in Sunderland or nearby hills with similar construction styles, similar toolkits, similar radiocarbon profiles. Rock art, ritual deposits, or distinctive symbolic objects that cluster around that same time and space. Basically, you want to see a culture, not a one-off anomaly. Without that, a single claimed monument, at an extreme age, looks more like an interpretive outlier than a paradigm shift. Now could humans of that time, in principle, develop small-scale engineering that grows into monumentality? Absolutely. You can imagine a scenario like this. Ice Age groups in Sunderland start terracing hillsides for temporary camps or ritual use. They stabilize slopes with local stone over generations. Certain hills become focal places, maybe aligned with rivers or particular stars or ancestral stories. Each generation adds a bit. Another terrace, another retaining wall, a small platform. Most work is modest, local, almost invisible in the record. But slowly, in a few places, you end up with something that starts to look monumental when viewed from the deep future. That's a plausible evolutionary pathway. You don't need cities. You don't need kings. You just need continuity, tradition, and a strong reason to keep coming back to one place. But plausibility in principle is not the same as support in practice. Right now, for Gunung Padang, the 25,000-year-old pyramid idea leans heavily on two kinds of data: ambiguous geophysical images and a set of deep radiocarbon dates whose context is controversial. That's not nothing. It's enough to justify more work. It's enough to keep the question open. It's not enough, yet, to claim that Ice Age Sundanese engineers were building true pyramids. To cross that line, the site would need to start looking less like a natural hill with layered human modifications, and more like a deliberately engineered structure whose plan, tools, associated settlements, and regional echoes all converge on the same astonishing story. In the next section, we'll look at what it would actually take to reach that point. What kinds of digs, tests, and collaborations could move Gunung Padang from sensational headline territory into robustly understood territory, and what hard questions any future team will have to answer, no matter which side of the debate they're on. If you really want to know what Gunung Padang is, you have to move from cool possibility to testable hypothesis. That means doing things that are slower, more boring, and way less headline-friendly than 25,000-year-old pyramid discovered. It starts with targeted excavation. Not random trenches wherever a drill hits something interesting, but carefully planned digs in places where the competing ideas make different predictions. If it's basically a natural hill with later terraces, then when you peel back those terraces you should see continuous, undisturbed natural geology underneath. Human layers that sit on top of it in logical stepped sequences. If it's a deeply engineered structure, you should eventually hit deliberate fill with consistent texture and composition, retaining walls or internal facings that are clearly artificial, sharp boundaries between construction phases that don't match what you'd expect from slow soil formation and natural slope processes. So one next step would be a few key, deep but narrow excavation units that go all the way down through those disputed levels, with every single layer described, photographed, sampled and mapped in 3 dimensions. That's how you turn "this looks like a layer in a core" into "this is a documented construction horizon with artifacts in place and clear stratigraphy." Context is everything. You don't just want radiocarbon dates, you want secure context for those dates. Charcoal locked into the floor of a clear occupation surface. Burned posts still in their post holes, organic residues trapped in the mortar of a wall. When a sample is taken, you want to know exactly where it came from, what it was touching, what lay above and below it, and how disturbed that layer looks. Then you send that material to more than one lab, independent labs, preferably in different countries, using different pretreatment protocols, all blind to the expectations of the team that sent the samples. And you don't just use one dating method, you use radiocarbon on multiple materials, charcoal, bone, plant remains. You use OSL, optically stimulated luminescence, on the sediments, to find out when the grains were last exposed to sunlight. You use paleomagnetic methods if there are fired features like hearths that record the Earth's magnetic field when they were last heated. If there's suitable mineral material, you consider uranium series dating. The idea is to build a web of dates, not a single thread. If all of those methods on multiple samples from clearly defined, construction-related contexts start pointing to the same very old age, then people pay attention. If instead the dates fall into clusters, some very old bits of reworked charcoal mixed into much younger deposits that tells a different story. Maybe what you're seeing is natural sediment that contains old carbon, later disturbed by younger building. Cross-checking like this is how you tell genuinely ancient construction from complex hill with a long history of use. But there's a catch. You can't just dig the whole thing up to find out. Gunung Padang isn't a sandbox. It's a protected heritage site. It's sacred to local communities. It sits in a living cultural landscape. So another next step is actually a conversation. Archaeologists, geologists, local communities, government agencies, and yes, even some of the more imaginative researchers all have to sit at the same table and agree on what's acceptable. How big can an excavation be without destabilizing the hill? Which areas are off-limits for religious reasons? What happens to the artifacts and samples? Who owns them? Who curates them? Who tells their story? You also have basic conservation issues. Exposing stone that has been protected by soil for centuries or millennia can accelerate weathering. Digging too many holes too fast can damage features you don't yet understand. Permits, environmental impact assessments, community consent. These aren't bureaucratic hurdles to get around. They're part of doing science ethically on a place that means something to living people. And then there's funding, deep, meticulous excavation with full documentation, multiple dating methods, and independent lab work is expensive. So whoever leads the next phase needs to be okay with something uncomfortable, open data. If you're asking for public money or even private grant money for a claim this big, the trade-off should be transparency. Make your raw geophysical data available. Publish complete stratigraphic logs and photos. Release not just your favourite radiocarbon dates, but all of them with lab codes, pretreatment details and discarded outliers clearly labelled and explained. Invite outside specialists, people who don't already agree with you, to participate, or at least to review the methods before you dig. This is the kind of collaboration that turns a controversial site into a case study everyone can learn from, no matter what the final interpretation is. While we're talking about learning from mysteries, quick note, if you like deep dives like this, we put together a book on 12 of the most intriguing unexplained sites and artifacts from around the world, places that, like Gunung Padang, sit right on the edge of what we understand. You can grab it on our website, link in the description, and there's a discount running this week if you want to check it out. Back to the hill. If new research does come out, how do you, sitting at home, judge whether it's solid? Look for a few telltale signs. Are the findings published in a peer-reviewed journal, or at least submitted to one? Preprints are fine, as long as they're headed towards scrutiny, not avoiding it. Do the authors describe their methods in enough detail that another team could, in principle, repeat the work? Are the dates tied to specific, clearly described contexts with diagrams, photos, and stratigraphic sections, or are they just numbers floating in space? Do they use multiple independent dating methods where they can, or is everything riding on a single kind of test? Do they compare their interpretations with alternative explanations, natural geology, later modification, reworked sediments, or do they jump straight to the most dramatic conclusion? And maybe most importantly, is the data accessible? Even if you're not going to download raw GPR files yourself, the fact that they're available for other scientists to check is a huge green flag. If, in the next few years, you see a project at Gunung Padang that ticks those boxes, targeted, careful excavation, multiple dating methods, open data, independent labs, community involvement, then, whatever it concludes, pro-pyramid or anti-pyramid, you'll know it's worth taking seriously. Because the point isn't just to prove or disprove one headline. The point is to let the hill tell its story as clearly as possible, and to accept that the real answer might be weirder, more complicated, and more interesting than either side expects. In the final section, we'll pull all of this together. What we can actually say right now about Gunung Padang. What we can't honestly claim yet, and why, even in the middle of all this uncertainty, the mystery itself is valuable. So where does all of this leave us? Let's start with what almost everyone who has actually worked on or published on Gunung Padang agrees on. There is a very real, very impressive human-made site on top of that hill. The stone terraces, the stepped platforms, the arranged basalt columns you can walk between today, those aren't accidents. They're deliberate constructions. People hauled those columns up, oriented them, stacked them, reworked them. They shaped the summit into a ritual landscape. Multiple lines of evidence converge on that. You have clear terrace edges and retaining structures near the surface. You have alignments of stones that follow patterns, not random tumble. You have artifacts and cultural material consistent with human use in the Holocene in the last several thousand years. And when you compare Gunung Padang to other megalithic sites in West Java and wider Indonesia, it fits into a broader regional tradition of building with columnar basalt on elevated places, often tied to ritual, ancestors and cosmology. So even in the most conservative interpretation, this is not just some anonymous volcanic bump. It's a significant archaeological site in a landscape where people have been marking and sacralizing hills for a very long time. That part is solid. Where things get shaky is when you leave the surface and dive down into the hill with words like pyramid and 25,000 years. Those claims hinge on three main ideas: that the internal structure is largely artificial, that there are deep, coherent construction phases far older than the visible terraces, and that some radiocarbon dates point to human activity tens of thousands of years before mainstream archaeology would expect anything like this. The problem is not that those things are impossible in some absolute sense. The problem is that right now, the evidence we have doesn't uniquely support those conclusions. The geophysical data, GPR images, resistivity models, seismic profiles absolutely show complexity inside the hill. They show different zones, different densities, voids, changes in material. But geology, especially in volcanic regions, is also messy and structured. Lava flows, columnar jointing, weathering horizons, landslides, soil creep, all of that can create layers, walls, and anomalies that look temptingly architectural in a blurry underground scan. Without excavation tying those patterns to clear observable construction features, you can't confidently say, this bright band is a buried wall, instead of this bright band is a natural contact between rock and colluvium, same with the dates. Very old radiocarbon numbers exist in some reports, but a date, by itself, is just an age for a piece of carbon, not for a building. We're missing what archaeologists care most about: airtight context. Charcoal securely embedded in masonry. Organic material sealed in a floor that's clearly part of a constructed level. A web of dates on different materials from repeated, well-documented layers, all converging. Until that's in place, 25,000-year-old pyramid is not an evidence-based description. It's a hypothesis, or honestly a marketing slogan, sitting several steps ahead of what the data can actually bear. So here's the balanced takeaway. You are allowed to be fascinated by Gunung Padang. You're allowed to think, wow, if even part of these deep-age claims turned out to be true, we'd have to rewrite some chapters of prehistory. Curiosity is not the enemy of science. It's the fuel. But standards of proof are not the enemy of curiosity either. They're how we keep from fooling ourselves, how we separate this could be from this almost certainly is. Right now, we can say Gunung Padang is a genuine archaeological site with constructed terraces of regional and cultural importance. It sits on and interacts with a complex volcanic hill whose internal structure is not fully understood. There are intriguing anomalies and some very old dates that deserve more careful, transparent investigation. We cannot honestly say that a fully artificial, neatly stacked pyramid core has been demonstrated, that the site, as a coherent, monumental construction, is 25,000 years old, or that a lost Ice Age civilization has been proved to exist under the grass. Those remain open questions, not settled facts. And that's okay. Because the real value of a place like this isn't just in getting to shout "told you so" about one extreme or the other. It's in watching the process. It's in seeing how data gets gathered, challenged, refined, and sometimes overturned. It's in recognizing that our picture of the past is provisional, but not arbitrary, that it changes when the evidence demands it, not just when the headlines do. If sites like Gunung Padang get you thinking about how much we don't know, and how much we might still discover, then they're doing something important, even in the middle of the controversy. And if you want to go deeper into that feeling, into the edge of knowing, we put together a book on 12 of the most intriguing prehistoric mysteries from around the world, sites and artifacts that push right up against what we can currently explain. You can read more about it and grab a copy on our website. The link is down in the description. If you found this breakdown useful, or if it made you rethink a headline you saw, it would really help if you'd hit like, subscribe to the channel, and maybe share this with someone else who loves ancient mysteries. Drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from, and if you want, what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to see how many corners of the world are tuning in while we try to make sense of this very strange hill in Indonesia.